There is a show that has been banned in over a dozen countries, pulled from streaming platforms, condemned by government officials, declared information warfare by a foreign deputy, and accused of offending virtually every culture on Earth. It has never been canceled permanently. It has never changed its approach. It has never apologized for the countries it reduced to a single punchline, the religions it turned into cutaway gags, or the historical atrocities it used as adventure backdrops. Family Guy has been running since 1999. It has aired over 400 episodes. And somewhere across those 400 episodes, it found a way to offend almost every country on Earth. Not accidentally, not occasionally, but consistently, repeatedly, and with the complete confidence of a show that decided very early on that nothing was off the table and never once reconsidered that decision. This is the story of how it did that, country by country, joke by joke, ban by ban.
Welcome to Red Umbrella. If this is your first time here, stay a while. This one goes deep. The United Kingdom, bad teeth, cricket, and the wrong kind of British. There is a moment in season 3 of Family Guy where a British man opens his mouth and the camera lingers just long enough on his teeth to make sure you got the joke. You got it. Everyone got it. The show needed you to get it because that joke, that one specific, lazy, recycled joke, is basically the entire theory of British people that Family Guy operates on for the next 20+ seasons. The episode is called One If by Clam, Two If by Sea. It is the second episode of season 3, and the setup is simple enough. A hurricane destroys the Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend most of their lives. A British man named Nigel Pinchley buys the property and turns it into an English pub. That is the whole conflict. An English pub replaces an American bar, and the Revolutionary War basically happens again on a smaller scale, which is how the show frames it, not how anyone in the actual episode would describe it. But that framing tells you everything about what the writers thought they were doing. Every British person in this episode speaks in the same accent. Not one of the dozens of actual accents that exist across the United Kingdom. Not Mancunian, not Geordie, not Scottish, not Welsh, not the South London accent that most of the country would actually recognize as normal, but the posh, clipped Hugh Grant accent that Americans associate with Britain because of movies. The kind of accent that a small percentage of people in England actually have. The show does not acknowledge this. It cannot acknowledge this because the joke only works if Britain is a single monolithic thing, and that single monolithic thing sounds like a period drama. The British characters in this episode love cricket. They are unfailingly polite. One of them frames Peter and his friends for arson while remaining polite about it, which the show treats as funny because politeness and criminal behavior existing in the same person is apparently a contradiction too rich to pass up. The King's Guard, the ceremonial soldier outside Buckingham Palace, is depicted storing his lunch inside his tall hat, which is played as one of those specifically British quirks that Americans find absurd. The lunch, if you were curious, sounds strange and inedible by American standards. That is the joke. British food, bad teeth, cricket, politeness. These four elements are rotated through the episode like a roulette wheel. What makes this worth stopping on is not that the jokes are mean. Family Guy is always mean. What makes it worth stopping on is how narrow the mean is. The show is not making fun of British people the way it might make fun of itself, with some awareness of complexity, some acknowledgement that the target is bigger than a single punchline. It is making fun of a cartoon version of Britain that exists primarily in American imagination, and it is doing so with absolute confidence that this cartoon version is the real one. British viewers pushed back on this, but not loudly enough to register anywhere official. The feedback exists in IMDb reviews and comment sections, which is where real audience reactions live when they are not organized enough to become protests. One British viewer wrote that the portrait of British people in this episode was probably the furthest thing from what they are actually like in real life. They noted that the vast majority of British people are working class, people more like the Griffin family than like Nigel Pinchley. They noted that only a tiny fraction of the country speaks with the accent the show gives all of its British characters. They noted that most British pubs are nothing like the episode depicts. And then they said something that cuts to the heart of what Family Guy does with every country it touches. Most American shows do not represent British people well, but never mind, never mind. That is the response. Not outrage, not an official complaint, not a government ban, just a quiet acknowledgement that the show got it wrong, and a shrug. Because what else do you do when a cartoon on the other side of the ocean has decided what your country is? The show came back to Britain repeatedly. In Road to Europe, also season 3, which was a very busy season for international grievances, Stewie obsesses over a British children's television program called Jolly Farm Review. He decides Britain must be a place of culture and education, and everything Quahog is not, because the children's show is warm and cozy and full of talking animals and wholesome lessons. He escapes from his family and tries to get there. When he finally arrives at the BBC studios, he discovers there is no actual farm. The characters are
are actors. The magic was fake. Britain, in this telling, is a disappointment, a place whose entire appeal is a manufactured illusion that collapses on contact with reality. That is a more sophisticated joke than the bad teeth, honestly. But the show sandwiches it between the bad teeth jokes, so the sophistication gets lost. In a later episode called No Country Club for Old Men from season 11, the Griffin family encounters British characters alongside Armenian characters, and the show treats both as objects of gentle cultural mockery. The Armenian character offers Stewie food, described as weird leaves, and Stewie reacts to the smell of the character's cologne. The British characters are given the usual treatment. Tom Hiddleston, Sean Bean, and Sharon Osbourne all provided their own voices for this episode, which is an interesting detail. 3 actual British people agreed to participate in an episode that caricatures British culture, which either means they found it harmless or they found the paycheck sufficient. The academic response to what Family Guy does with British stereotypes is worth understanding even in plain terms. A researcher studying British culture in American comedy noted that Family Guy specializes in personal mockery of those outside the norm as stereotypical caricatures.
She also noted something that the show's defenders always point to. MacFarlane is part Irish, and Peter Griffin is Irish-American, and the show mocks American culture just as aggressively as it mocks everyone else. The argument is that equal opportunity mockery neutralizes offense. If everyone gets made fun of, nobody is being singled out. The problem with that argument, when you hold it against what the show actually does with Britain, is that not everyone gets made fun of equally. Britain gets a single repeated joke, bad teeth, posh accent, cricket, across multiple seasons and multiple episodes. The joke does not evolve. It does not deepen. It does not gain any awareness of the actual country it is supposedly satirizing. It just recycles itself, season after season, like a greatest hits album where the only hit is a song about dental hygiene. The name Neville is used for the British version of Peter in one episode, British Peter, essentially. Neville announces he is going to the pub, and the pub is called something like the Dog and Cat and Bull and Whistle and Fiddle and Cock and Pig and Wolf and Carriage and Fife and Other Wolf. The joke is that British pub names are long and specific and pile on with animal and object combinations until they become absurd. This is actually based in something real. British pub names genuinely do follow a traditional pattern of combining animals, objects, and proper nouns. The show takes that real thing and stretches it to the point of parody. This is the one moment where the British jokes feel like they came from someone who had at least looked up British pub naming conventions before writing the scene, rather than just reaching for the nearest cultural shorthand. It is a small thing, but it is there. What is not there, across any of the show's British episodes, is any acknowledgement of the Britain that actually exists for most people who live in it. The working class communities, the regional accents, the enormous cultural variation between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, all of which the show collapses into a single, posh voice. The show's Britain is a place frozen in a particular American fantasy of what Britain is, and it has no interest in updating that fantasy. This is not unique to Britain. It is the operating method. But Britain is where the show establishes the method most clearly, because the British episodes come early, they come often, and the jokes stay exactly the same from season 3 to season 11 without any visible evolution. The formula is set, and the formula is, pick the 2 or 3 things that Americans most associate with a country, play them as far past reality as you can, and repeat until the laugh track stops. The laugh track never really stops. That is the other thing. These episodes perform well. Viewers watch them and find them funny. The question of whether funny is enough, whether a joke that gets a laugh is automatically okay, regardless of what it flattens or ignores, is one that Family Guy has never shown much interest in answering. The show's position, demonstrated through its behavior rather than stated explicitly, seems to be that the laugh is the only metric that matters. Britain, officially, never responded. No ban, no formal complaint from any government office, no organized protest from any cultural institution. The BBC has broadcast Family Guy. ITV2 has broadcast Family Guy. The show has aired in the United Kingdom continuously since September 1999, including the episodes that mock British culture specifically. The country that the show has been making bad teeth jokes about for over 2 decades keeps airing it. There is probably something funny about that, though Family Guy did not write it. What Britain did not do, and what would have required a very different kind of episode, is make Family Guy reconsider what it was doing. The jokes worked. The show moved on. The next country was already in the writer's room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that country, the one that came next, the one where the jokes stopped being about teeth and started being about something that a lot of Germans would prefer the world forget, had a much more complicated history to mine for comedy. The tour guide on that Munich bus has a pamphlet with a very specific gap in it, and what Brian finds in that gap might be the single most revealing thing about how this show understands the line between dark comedy and something else entirely. Section 2, Germany, the vacation that wasn't there, is a pamphlet. That is where the whole thing starts. Brian Griffin is sitting on a tour bus in Munich, Germany, flipping through a history pamphlet that the tour company handed out at the beginning of the trip. The pamphlet covers Munich's beautiful architecture. It covers famous writers who came from the city. It covers the historic beer halls. And then there is a gap. A big, clean, empty gap where the years 1939 to 1945 should be. 6 years of German history, missing entirely, like someone took a pair of scissors to the timeline and quietly disposed of the evidence. Brian notices the gap. Brian always notices things like this. He is the character the show uses when it wants to make a point that requires someone with at least a passing familiarity with history, and the point the show wants to make here is hard to miss. He asks the tour guide about it. He says, very reasonably, that he is not seeing anything about German history between 1939 and 1945. There is just a big gap. The tour guide's response is immediate. Everyone was on vacation. That is the joke. 6 years that included the Second World War, the invasion of Poland, the bombing of London, the deaths of tens of millions of people across Europe. Everyone was on vacation. The tour guide says it with complete confidence, moving on to the next landmark before Brian can process what he just heard. The bus keeps moving. Munich rolls past the windows. The tour continues. Brian does not let it go. He presses. He points out that Germany invaded Poland in 1939. The tour guide pivots instantly. We were invited. Punch was served. Check with Poland. Brian tries a different angle. He mentions Thomas Mann, the famous German writer who left Germany during the rise of the Nazi Party, arguing that Mann's departure proved how tight the grip of that era was on the country. The tour guide cuts him off. No, Mann left to manage a Dairy Queen. Brian says that is preposterous. The tour guide says he will hear no more insinuations about the German people. And then the tour guide breaks. He starts screaming in German. The actual German words he shouts translate to, "You will sit down. You will be quiet. You will not insult Germany." And as he shouts this, he raises his arm in a Nazi salute. Everyone on the bus, tourists and locals alike, goes completely silent and stares at him. He lowers his arm. He smiles. He points out a nearby building. Oh yes, Munich is renowned for its historic beer halls. The scene is from Road to Europe, the 20th episode of Season 3, which originally aired on February 7th, 2002. It was written by Daniel Palladino. The episode was actually going to be called Road to Baghdad originally, before the writers changed direction after September 11th, 2001, and redirected the plot toward Europe, landing in Saudi Arabia first before making its way through the continent. The German bus tour sequence is a small part of a larger episode, but it is the part that gets remembered because it is hard to forget a tour guide doing a Nazi salute on a family cartoon. The joke lands because it is built on something real. Germany does have a complicated relationship with its own history, and that relationship has been the subject of serious conversation for decades. But the specific version of that complication that Family Guy presents, a tour guide who literally denies the Second World War happened, claims Germany was invited into Poland, and breaks into a Nazi salute the moment he feels cornered, is not a commentary on any actual German denial. It is a cartoon. It is the most extreme possible version of a real thing,
pushed so far past reality that it becomes its own separate joke about American assumptions, rather than anything rooted in actual German behavior.
The irony that the show does not acknowledge, and that most viewers watching in 2002 probably did not stop to consider, is that modern Germany is one of the most aggressive countries in the world when it comes to confronting its own history. Munich itself, the specific city depicted in this scene, is home to multiple museums and memorials dedicated to the victims of the Nazi period. The Dachau concentration camp memorial is less than 20 kilometers from Munich's city center. The Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism opened in Munich in 2015. Germany has laws against Holocaust denial, actual laws with criminal penalties. Displaying the Nazi salute in public in Germany is illegal. The tour guide doing a Nazi salute on Family Guy would be committing a crime in the country the show is setting the joke in. The show does not know this, or does not care, or decided it did not matter. The joke is about American assumptions of Germany, not about Germany itself. The pamphlet with the gap is not a real pamphlet. The tour guide is not a real tour guide. They are props in a joke that is really about how Americans think about Germany, which is to say, primarily through the lens of the Second World War, with everything before and after that compressed or ignored. This is the same problem as the British episodes, expressed differently. Britain gets reduced to its surface quirks. Germany gets reduced to its darkest historical chapter. Both reductions are comfortable for American audiences because they require no new information. You do not need to know anything about Germany beyond the most basic historical facts to understand the bus tour joke. The joke meets you exactly where you are and asks nothing more of you. The episode does not stay in Germany long. Brian and Stewie move on, through Switzerland, through Amsterdam, eventually to the BBC studios in London. Germany is a stop on the tour, not the destination. But the stop leaves a mark, because the show comes back to Germany in a much bigger way 6 years later. Road to Germany aired on October 26, 2008. It is the third episode of Season 7. The setup begins at the Griffin House, where everyone is watching the Academy Awards. Mort Goldman, the show's main Jewish character, needs to use the bathroom urgently after taking laxatives. He runs into what he thinks is a portable toilet in Stewie's room. It is not a portable toilet. It is Stewie's time machine. Mort gets sent into the past. Brian and Stewie take the return pad and go back in time to retrieve him. They land in Warsaw, Poland. The date is September 1st, 1939. This is the day Nazi Germany invaded Poland, the event that is widely considered the beginning of the Second World War. Mort finds himself in a synagogue full of people he recognizes as his own dead relatives. He thinks he has arrived in heaven. The show then places a Jewish character, the show's main Jewish character, inside the Holocaust as a setting for an adventure story. Stewie disguises himself as Adolf Hitler to sneak into a Berlin nuclear laboratory. Brian and Mort dress as Nazi officers. They run into the real Hitler, who orders their execution. Stewie and Brian begin a comedy routine to delay Hitler long enough for Mort to complete the mission. They escape. The episode ends with Stewie erasing the timeline so that none of it ever technically happened, including the version of Mort who traveled with them, who Stewie kills by shoving him back into the time machine and blowing it up with a ray gun. The episode received strong reviews. IGN gave it a 9.6 out of 10. The reviewer called it one of the best episodes of the show in years, and praised what he called hilariously offensive humor. It received an Emmy Award nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009, which made it one of 3 episodes submitted by the show that year for that award. Seth MacFarlane himself identified it as one of the nominated episodes. The gap between the critical reception and what the episode is actually doing is worth sitting with. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people, along with millions of others, carried out by the Nazi government of Germany, is used here as an adventure backdrop. The danger Mort faces is real within the story, but the tone is not. Mort's mid-episode breakdown, where he screams that he hates this place, and this is a bunch of garbage, and he is a Jew in Nazi-occupied Europe, is played for comedy. The comedy works because of how far past reasonable the breakdown goes,
the language, the escalation, the specificity. But what is underneath the comedy is a character genuinely expressing the terror of the situation he is in, and the show uses that terror as a punchline and then moves on.
The ending is the most telling choice the writers made. Stewie erases the timeline.
The events of the episode are undone. Nobody remembers any of it happened. The Holocaust as adventure setting was always going to end this way, because the show could not let any real consequence attach to what it was doing. If the timeline stayed intact, the episode would be asking its audience to hold two things at once: the comedy and the weight of the historical reality underneath it. Erasing the timeline lets the comedy exist without the weight. The show gets to have the joke and also get away clean. This is a specific kind of creative choice that reveals something about what Family Guy thinks comedy is for. The British episodes use stereotypes because stereotypes are easy and familiar. The German episodes use historical atrocity because historical atrocity, when processed through enough cartoon distance, becomes a different kind of familiar.
The Nazis are the most recognizable villains in modern history.
Everyone knows who they are. Everyone knows what they did. That shared knowledge is the raw material the show turns into jokes, and the show does it with enough craft that the jokes land, and the landing is the end of the conversation. Germany, as a country, did not officially respond to either episode. Road to Europe aired in 2002 and was not pulled or banned in Germany. Road to Germany aired in 2008 and was not pulled or banned in Germany. Both episodes are available in Germany with standard ratings. A country with criminal laws against Holocaust denial and against public display of the Nazi salute did not move to restrict a cartoon that depicts a tour guide doing a Nazi salute and places its characters inside the Holocaust as a comedy setting. The German media regulatory system operates differently from many other countries, and the episodes did not trigger a formal response. What did happen is more informal.
German viewers who encountered these episodes through the internet and fan communities pushed back in the places where fans push back: forums, comment sections, the usual locations. The criticism followed a consistent line. The show reduces Germany to its worst historical moment, which is the one thing the country has spent the most effort trying to move beyond. This is not an unfair reading. The pamphlet joke in Road to Europe and the entire premise of Road to Germany are both built entirely on the Nazi period. There is no other Germany in either episode. There is no modern Germany, no cultural Germany, no Germany that exists outside the shadow of 1939 to 1945. The tour guide's pamphlet has a gap. The show's understanding of Germany has a gap too, but the show does not notice its own gap. It is too busy pointing at the tour guide's
quote, _1__. What is coming next makes the Germany episodes look almost careful by comparison, because while Family Guy was willing to use the Holocaust as a backdrop for an adventure story, it was also willing to take on the Muslim world in a way that did not stay contained to the television screen. The next episode did not just offend a country, it got caught up in a real-world tragedy, got pulled from every streaming platform, and turned into the center of a conspiracy theory that spread across the internet in the hours after one of the most devastating attacks on American soil in a decade. The show had made offensive jokes before. This time, the joke was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the world noticed in a way that could not be undone by erasing a timeline. Section 3. The Muslim World. Turban Cowboy and the Boston Marathon Catastrophe. On March 17, 2013,
Family Guy aired an episode called Turban Cowboy. It was the 15th episode of season 11 and the 203rd episode of the show overall. It was written by Artie Johan and Sean Reese and directed by Joe Vox. By the standards of what Family Guy had done before, it was not the most extreme thing the show had ever put on television. It was not even close to the most extreme thing the show had aired that season. But 30 days after it aired, a bomb went off at the Boston Marathon, and Turban Cowboy stopped being just a controversial episode and became something the show had never had to deal with before. Evidence in a conspiracy theory. A piece of alleged proof that a cartoon had predicted, or possibly inspired, a terrorist attack on American citizens. That is not what happened.
But the distance between what actually happened and what millions of people believed happened in the hours and days after April 15th, 2013, is the real story of this episode. And to understand that distance, you have to understand what the episode actually contains. The plot begins at the Drunken Clam. Peter and his friends decide they need to do something to shake up their routine. They settle on skydiving. Peter loves it immediately and keeps going back, even as his jumps keep ending in accidents. One of those accidents lands him in a hospital in Las Vegas, where he meets a man named Mahmoud. Mahmoud is Muslim. Peter and Mahmoud get along immediately. Peter is genuinely interested in Islam, not in a thoughtful way, but in the way Peter is interested in anything, which is surface level and self-serving. He likes the hat. He likes that Muslim wives are described in the episode as more obedient. He shouts a reference to a famous movie catchphrase when he does things, treating it as something Muslims say, which they do not. Brian calls out Joe and Quagmire for being suspicious of Mahmoud simply because he is Muslim. The episode, for a stretch, seems to be making a point about Islamophobia, about how American men like Joe and Quagmire default to suspicion toward Muslim people without cause. Then, Mahmoud turns out to be a terrorist. He is not just a man who holds extreme views. He is actively planning to blow up a bridge in Quahog. He invites Peter to a gathering that turns out to be a meeting of his terrorist cell. Peter gets pulled into the plan without fully understanding what is happening. He ends up behind the wheel of a van loaded with explosives, driving toward the bridge, held at gunpoint. Joe arrives in time to stop the detonator from being triggered. Mahmoud and the rest of the cell are arrested. The bridge explodes anyway, accidentally, because Peter dials his cell phone without realizing it is connected to the explosives. Peter forces everyone to run. The episode received terrible reviews. The AV Club gave it a grade of D. The critic wrote that Turban Cowboy feels like an episode made in 2002 and left on a shelf for a decade, completely unaware of just how uniformly Middle Eastern characters are shown as terrorists. TV Fanatic gave it 2.5 stars out of 5. The general critical view was that the episode tried to have it both ways. It wanted credit for the anti-Islamophobia message Brian delivers early on, while also delivering a plot where the Muslim character is in fact a terrorist, which destroys the message entirely. The show wanted to seem aware of the stereotype, while also leaning on it completely. Critics noticed. But the episode also contained something separate from the main plot. Something unconnected. A cutaway gag. Family Guy runs on cutaway gags. They are the engine of the show. Quick, disconnected scenes that break from whatever is happening in the main story to deliver a joke, then snap back. They are not part of the plot. They do not connect to anything around them. They exist to be funny on their own terms and then disappear. The cutaway and Turban Cowboy that would go on to change the episode's entire history showed Peter Griffin winning the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the runners, knocking them down as he crossed the finish line. It was completely disconnected from the main story about Mahmoud and the terrorist plot. It was a throwaway sports joke, using the Boston Marathon as a setting the way the show uses any recognizable American event, as a frame to hang a quick gag on. On April 15th, 2013, 30 days after Turban Cowboy aired, 2 bombs went off near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. One of them was an 8-year-old boy. 176 people were wounded. 17 of those people lost limbs. It was one of the worst attacks on American soil in years, and the country was in shock within hours. Sometime in that same window, someone on the internet did something specific and deliberate. They took the cutaway from Turban Cowboy showing Peter driving through the Boston Marathon runners and edited it together with a completely separate scene from the same episode in which Peter dials a cell phone and explosions go off as part of the Mahmoud storyline. In the actual episode, these 2 scenes are not connected. They are not near each other. They come from entirely different parts of the story. But edited together, back to back, they made it look like Peter Griffin had driven through the Boston Marathon and then triggered a bomb. Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist and radio host who ran the InfoWars website, took this edited clip and pushed it to his audience. He presented it as evidence that Family Guy had predicted the Boston Marathon bombing. The clip spread. Millions of people saw it. Many of them believed it was real, that one episode of a cartoon had, weeks before the actual event, depicted something terrifyingly close to what had just happened in Boston. Seth MacFarlane responded on Twitter the same day. He called the edited clip abhorrent. He said the event was a crime and a tragedy, and that his thoughts were with the victims. He did not call it a joke or defend the episode. He was clear that what was circulating was not what his show had made. Fox acted immediately. The network pulled Turban Cowboy from Fox.com, from Hulu, and from Amazon. They stated publicly that they had no immediate plans to broadcast the episode again. They worked with YouTube to remove copies of both the edited clip and the original episode from the platform.
A repeat episode of New Girl that contained a throwaway line about a suspicious bag was also pulled from its scheduled slot, demonstrating how carefully Fox was managing anything that could be perceived as connected to the attack. The episode stayed off Hulu for 9 years. It did not return until September 2022. During those 9 years, it was available in other countries. It could be watched on Fox 8 in Australia, on ITV2 in the United Kingdom, and on Disney Plus in Canada. The ban was American. The discomfort was American. The rest of the world, where the Boston Marathon is a real event but a more distant one, did not feel the same need to make the episode disappear. The conspiracy theory was false. The Week, CNN, and multiple other outlets ran pieces clearly explaining that the edited clip was a hoax, that the two scenes had been taken from unrelated parts of the episode and spliced together to create a false impression. Family Guy did not predict the bombing.
The show did not inspire it. The edited clip was a lie that spread in the hours when people were frightened and looking for patterns in chaos. But false information that spreads at the speed the clip spread does not fully disappear when it is corrected. Years later, there are still people who believe that Family Guy predicted the Boston Marathon bombing because the correction never travels as far or as fast as the original claim. What the episode actually did, independent of the conspiracy theory, independent of the real-world timing, was something the critics identified clearly in their reviews. It recycled one of the most damaging stereotypes about Muslim people at a moment in history when that stereotype was already doing real harm. The show's Muslim character is a terrorist, not a complex person who holds extreme views as part of a broader personality, not someone whose background or reasoning is explored. A terrorist. The anti-Islamophobia message that Brian delivers early in the episode is designed to give the show cover, to let it seem like it is aware of the problem, while the plot underneath that message proves the stereotype true. That structural choice, where the show appears to critique a prejudice while actually confirming it, was what critics found most difficult to defend. The Muslim world's response to Family Guy goes beyond one episode. Egypt banned the show entirely. Iran banned it. Indonesia, Malaysia, and several other countries with large Muslim populations banned it or restricted it. The reasons given for these bans are not always specific to Turban Cowboy. The bans reflect a broader response to what the show does across its entire run. The repeated use of Muslim characters as terrorists or extremists, the mockery of Islamic practice, the treatment of Arab identity and Muslim identity as interchangeable when they are not. An academic study of the show's portrayal of Islam noted that Family Guy has made significant negative references to the Muslim religion across multiple seasons, not just in Turban Cowboy. It pointed to a Palestinian alarm clock cutaway that explodes after shouting a religious phrase, depicting the assumption that all Palestinians are Muslim and all Muslims are violent. It pointed to scenes where Muslim culture is reduced to a hat and an obedient wife. It identified a pattern, not a single episode. The Arabic dub of Family Guy, which aired on a channel called Al Majd TV, is one of the more remarkable responses to the show's content. Rather than banning the show outright, the channel chose to air a heavily altered version. All music was removed from the dub because music is considered off-limits in some interpretations of Islamic teaching. Scenes that conflicted with Islamic values were cut or replaced. Quagmire, who is left-handed, had his scenes flipped so that he appeared to be using his right hand because the left hand carries specific negative associations in Islamic tradition. The show was not just translated, It was reconstructed, scene by scene, into something different enough to be acceptable. It is a strange thing to consider that the same show exists simultaneously in an unedited American version and in an Arabic version where the music has been removed and the offensive content replaced, and both versions have an audience. Turban Cowboy is the episode that most people point to when they talk about Family Guy and the Muslim world. But it is not the beginning of that conversation. The show had been making jokes at the expense of Muslim people and Arab people since its early seasons. Turban Cowboy is simply the episode where the joke collided with a real event in a way that could not be contained, where the timing stripped away the comedy entirely and left only the offense underneath. The episode went from a badly reviewed installment of a long-running show to a piece of evidence in a conspiracy theory, to a banned episode, to a slow return 9 years later, to a complicated piece of television history that no single description fully captures. Seth MacFarlane said the clip circulating online was abhorrent. He was talking about the edited version, the fake version. But the word applies more broadly than he may have intended. The real episode was not abhorrent in the same way the hoax was. But it was not careful either. It was not precise. It took a real and complicated subject, the treatment of Muslim people in post-September 11th America, the reflexive suspicion, the unfair assumptions, and it tried to address that subject while also using it for entertainment. The result satisfied neither goal. The anti-prejudice message was too thin to land. The entertainment was too clumsy to fly. What the Boston Marathon did was reveal the episode for what it was, by placing it next to something real. Comedy about violence is easy when the violence stays fictional. When the real thing arrives, the joke does not disappear, it just stops being funny, and what is left behind is the question of whether it should have been made in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That question follows the show from this point forward. But the next place the show went looking for material was not the Muslim world or the Middle East. It was Russia. And the response it got there did not come from an edited clip or a conspiracy theory. It came from an actual government official, standing in front of a camera, using the phrase information warfare to describe what a cartoon had done to her city. Section 4. Russia. The Meg song that started an international incident. Meg Griffin does not have a good life. This is not an accident. It is one of the show's longest-running structural choices. Meg is the Griffin family's punching bag, ignored by her father, overlooked by her mother, mocked by her brother, and treated by the show itself as someone whose suffering exists primarily to generate jokes. She has no real friends. She has no lasting romantic relationships. She is the family member that everyone, including the audience, is trained to dismiss. When Peter lists the things he cares about, Meg does not make the list. When the family is in danger, Meg is the last one anyone thinks about. The show has been doing this to her since season 1, and it has never stopped. So when season 21 decided to give Meg a 2-part finale centered entirely around her, an episode where she travels to another country, falls in love, and briefly builds something that looks like a life, it was a significant choice. The country they sent her to was Russia. The city was Chelyabinsk. And what the show depicted when Meg arrived in Chelyabinsk triggered a response that went well beyond any complaint the show had received in years. The 2 episodes are called From Russia with Love and Adult Education. They are the 19th and 20th episodes of season 21, making them the season finale. From Russia with Love aired on April 30th, 2023. The plot begins with Brian. He goes on Instagram Live to discuss writing, an activity he takes very seriously and that nobody else in the family takes seriously at all. His audience is tiny. But he keeps going, because Brian believes in himself with a consistency that the show finds endlessly useful for comedy. He notices that his account has been given a verification checkmark, the kind that signals an account is real and notable. Stewie points out that the checkmark is the wrong color. It is green rather than blue. This means Brian's account has been hacked. Meg gets involved. She and Stewie and Brian trace the hack to its source, a user in Chelyabinsk, Russia. The 3 of them decide to travel there to confront the hacker in person, which is exactly the kind of decision that only makes sense inside a Family Guy episode, where characters can fly to Russia to deal with a social media problem without anyone commenting on how unusual that is. They arrive in Chelyabinsk and find the hacker, a young Russian man named Ivan. Meg meets Ivan, and something unexpected happens. She likes him. He likes her. By the standards of Meg's romantic history, which is almost entirely composed of rejection and humiliation, this is remarkable. She decides to stay in Chelyabinsk. She is happy there in a way she is almost never happy in Quahog. The first episode ends with Meg choosing Russia over home, which sets up the second part. Adult education picks up where the first episode ended. Meg is still in Chelyabinsk. She is still with Ivan. And then the show does what Family Guy does. It gives Meg a musical number. She sings a song called This Old Town as she walks through the city. And the sequence is built as a direct reference to the opening of Beauty and the Beast, the Disney animated film from 1991. In that film, the character Belle sings a song called Belle as she walks through her small French village. And the visual language, the movement through the streets, the interaction with the surroundings, the sense of a character describing her world, is what the Family Guy sequence is copying and twisting. Meg sings about Chelyabinsk, and as she sings, the show depicts what she is walking through. What she walks through is not a charming village. The buildings around her are crumbling. The streets are not clean. The people she passes are visibly drunk, some of them lying on the ground near fires they have built to stay warm. There are references to radiation. There is a mention of cow plague. Russian police appear in the background, beating a man who is holding a Ukrainian flag. Secret agents watch from the shadows. Somewhere in the sequence, a nuclear reactor begins to melt down. The song is upbeat and warm. The images underneath it are a catalog of everything a Russian government official would most want the world not to associate with a Russian city. Mila Kunis voices Meg. She has voiced Meg since Season 2, when she replaced the original voice actress Lacey Chabert. Kunis was born in Ukraine. In the early months of Russia's military actions in Ukraine in 2022, Kunis and her husband Ashton Kutcher publicly supported Ukraine, helping to raise millions of dollars for Ukrainian relief efforts. Both of them spoke openly about the situation. Kutcher appeared in videos, Kunis gave interviews. Their position was not ambiguous. The woman voicing Meg Griffin in an episode mocking a Russian city was one of the most publicly visible Ukrainian-born voices in American entertainment at the time the episode aired. The response from Russia came quickly. Yana Lantratova, a deputy in the Chelyabinsk region, a government official, spoke to a Russian publication called Rise about what the show had done. She did not speak quietly. She called the episode a deliberately offensive artistic image that has nothing to do with reality. She said it was a deliberate work against our country. She used the phrase information warfare through artistic works, which is not the language of someone filing a television complaint. It is the language of someone describing an act of hostility between nations. She called for a complete ban of Family Guy in Russia. The specific phrase information warfare is worth stopping on. This is a government official in Russia describing a cartoon, a show about a talking dog and a baby who wants to take over the world, and a man who once fought a giant chicken for 20 minutes, as an act of warfare. The language is extreme, but it is also revealing, because it tells you exactly how seriously the Russian government takes its image, and how little tolerance there is for depictions that undercut the version of Russia that the government wants the world to see. Sergei Sumleny, who is an expert on Eastern Europe with a significant following online, responded to the controversy in a way that cut the official complaint off at its knees. He posted images of the real Chelyabinsk on Twitter. He wrote that he had seen the real Chelyabinsk, and that the Family Guy video was very authentic. Multiple other users responded to his post with their own images of the city, making similar observations. The argument being made, by people who had actually been to Chelyabinsk, was not that the show was unfair. The argument was that the show was accurate. Chelyabinsk is a real city in Russia's Ural Mountains region. It is an industrial city with a significant history of environmental problems. In 2013, 10 years before this episode aired, a meteor exploded in the atmosphere above Chelyabinsk, causing widespread damage and injuring over 1,000 people. The city is not unknown to the outside world, but it is also not a tourist destination, and the version of it that the Russian government presents publicly and the version that residents and outside observers describe are not always the same. Lantratova said the show's depiction had nothing to do with reality. Sumleni and others said it was very authentic. Both statements cannot be fully true. One of them is much better supported by photographic evidence. The ban that Lantratova called for did not happen immediately. As of the reporting around the episode in May 2023, Family Guy fans in Russia could still watch the show. The threat of a ban was real, the official demand was on record, but the actual removal of the show from Russian access had not taken place. This is consistent with how Russia handles cultural content. The language of prohibition is deployed as a message, and the actual follow-through depends on how important the issue remains over time. Russia's history with Family Guy goes back further than this episode.
Peter Griffin has appeared in a boxing match with Vladimir Putin in an earlier episode, a match that was rigged, which is itself a specific kind of joke. Putin has appeared in 4 different Family Guy episodes across the show's run. In one of those episodes, he is depicted behaving like a villain from an old adventure film. Specifically, his behavior mirrors the villain Major Arnold Todt from Raiders of the Lost Ark, the 1981 film where Todt is a cruel, sneering agent who gets his face melted at the end. Comparing a sitting head of state to a character best known for having his face melted is not a subtle joke. The show made it anyway. Russia did not formally respond to those episodes the way it responded to Chelyabinsk. The difference is geography. Putin appearing in a cartoon is one thing. A specific Russian city, a real place where real people live, being depicted as a wasteland of drunk residents, crumbling buildings, radiation, and police brutality is something that hits differently. Putin is a global figure. Chelyabinsk is a local identity. When the show mocked Chelyabinsk, it mocked the people who live there and call it home. That is a different kind of offense than mocking a politician. What makes the episode genuinely complicated is the context it aired in. The Russia-Ukraine war was ongoing when From Russia with Love and Adult Education were broadcast. Mila Kunis had been publicly supporting Ukraine for over a year at that point. The episode shows Russian police beating a man with a Ukrainian flag. These are not politically neutral choices. The show was not simply making fun of a foreign city the way it made fun of Britain's teeth or Ireland's whiskey. It was making those jokes while a war was being fought, while the show's own star had a direct personal connection to that war, and while the country being mocked was being widely criticized internationally for its actions. Whether that context makes the episode more justified or less justified depends entirely on where you are standing. For an American audience watching in 2023, the episode likely reads as pointed comedy that reflects a shared frustration with Russia's actions. For a Russian viewer, or for a Russian government official trying to maintain a particular national image, the episode looks like American entertainment using comedy as a vehicle for something more deliberate. Lantratova called it information warfare. Seth MacFarlane has said publicly that the show's fans are smart enough to know it is all in good fun. Both of those descriptions are probably partially right, and both are probably partially incomplete. Comedy can be in good fun and also be a carrier for something more pointed. The two are not mutually exclusive. A joke can make you laugh and still land with the force of a real opinion underneath it. The Chelyabinsk episode did not end Family Guy in Russia. The show has not been fully banned there. The official complaint is on record, the demand was made, and the show kept going. Family Guy has been canceled twice in the United States, and survived both times. A Russian regional deputy calling for its removal was not going to accomplish what 2 American network cancellations could not. But the episode did something that the German episodes and the British episodes did not do. It made a government official stand in front of a camera and respond. It made the phrase information warfare appear in the same sentence as the name of a cartoon. It placed the show inside an active geopolitical conflict in a way that none of its other international controversies had managed. Britain shrugged. Germany did not officially respond. The Muslim world banned the show, but those bans came gradually and for accumulated reasons. Russia responded immediately, officially, and with language that treated a Family Guy episode as a national security matter. That is a different category of reaction. And what it tells you is that the show's ability to offend did not shrink as it got older and more established. If anything, the world around it became more sensitive to exactly the kind of jokes the show has always made. Jokes about real places, real people, real wounds. And the collision between the show's consistent approach and a world that had become less willing to absorb that approach produced moments that the show's first decade never had to navigate. Quote, _3 __. The countries that banned Family Guy outright did not all do so for the same reasons. Some banned it for the gay characters. Some banned it for the religious mockery. Some banned it for general offensiveness. The next section covers all of them, the full map of where the show cannot be watched, and what each country's specific reason reveals about the line that Family Guy keeps crossing, over and over, in a different place each time. Section 5. Egypt, Iran, and the countries that banned it outright. The list is longer than most people realize. Egypt, Iran, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Korea, India, Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, South Africa, Venezuela. These are not small countries. These are not obscure markets that a television show from America would barely notice losing. Combined, these nations represent well over 2 billion people. Family Guy cannot be legally broadcast in any of them. The show that airs every week on Fox in the United States, the show that has been running continuously since 1999 with the exception of its 2 cancellations, the show that received an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series, that show is banned across a significant portion of the populated world. The bans did not all happen at the same time. They did not all happen for the same reason. And the reasons themselves, when you line them up next to each other, tell you something interesting about what different parts of the world have decided comedy is and is not allowed to do. Each ban is a separate verdict. Together, they form a picture of every boundary the show has ever crossed, organized by geography. Start with Egypt. Egypt's ban on Family Guy is described consistently in reporting as being the result of moral censorship and religious reasons. Egypt is a majority Muslim country, and its broadcast regulations reflect that. The country has a history of restricting content that it determines conflicts with Islamic values or with public morality more broadly. Family Guy conflicts with both. The show mocks religion, not just Islam, but all religion, regularly and without much concern for how the mockery lands. God appears in Family Guy as a dirty old man having sex with a prostitute while brushing off a teenage Jesus who needs help. Jesus appears in multiple episodes in ways that Egyptian censors would find deeply offensive. The show's treatment of Islamic practice specifically, the turban cowboy episode, the Palestinian alarm clock cutaway, the repeated depiction of Muslim characters as either naive or dangerous, would be more than enough to trigger a ban in a country where religious content is regulated. But the Egyptian ban is not episode-specific. It is not a response to one thing the show did. It is a total prohibition, which means the decision-makers looked at Family Guy as a whole and determined that the show's overall character was incompatible with what Egyptian broadcast standards allow. That is a different kind of verdict than pulling one offensive episode. It is a judgment about what the show is, not just what one episode did. Iran's ban has a specific and clearly stated reason: gay characters. Family Guy has gay characters. It has had them throughout its run. It has also made many jokes at the expense of gay people that have generated their own controversies. The episode Quagmire's Dad, from Season 8, centers on the discovery that Quagmire's father is a transgender woman, and the way the show handles that storyline was criticized heavily by LGBT advocacy groups and writers at the time of broadcast. Brian's reaction to the news, his physical disgust after kissing Ida, Quagmire's father, before learning she was transgender, was identified by critics as deeply offensive to transgender people. The episode is still available and has not been pulled, but its reception demonstrated that the show's relationship with LGBT content has always been complicated. Iran's government does not make those distinctions. The ban is not about how gay characters are portrayed. It is about their existence. Iran operates under laws that criminalize homosexuality, and its broadcast regulations prohibit content that depicts gay people in any form. Family Guy has gay characters, so Family Guy cannot air.
The logic is that simple and that absolute. What makes the Iran situation particularly striking is something that exists in parallel to the ban. Iran produced an unauthorized remake of Modern Family, an American sitcom that includes a gay couple as central characters, and the Iranian version simply removed those characters entirely. The country's response to gay content in television is not always prohibition. Sometimes it is erasure. But with Family Guy, the content is woven too deeply into the show's fabric to be removed scene by scene, so the whole show goes. Vietnam's ban and Indonesia's ban fall under a broader category that gets described in reporting as offensiveness and indecency in countries without strong free speech protections. This framing is accurate, but also incomplete, because it makes the bans sound like they are about abstract principles rather than specific content. Vietnam and Indonesia both have broadcast standards that treat adult content, sexual humor, and religious mockery as categories that require regulation. Family Guy fails on all three counts. The show contains explicit sexual humor throughout its run, depicts religious figures in ways that most regulatory bodies in these countries would consider blasphemous, and pushes into territory involving drug use, violence, and adult behavior that falls outside what Vietnamese and Indonesian broadcast standards permit. Indonesia is the country in the world with the largest Muslim population. Its broadcast regulations are shaped significantly by Islamic values alongside its general broadcast standards. Family Guy's treatment of Muslim characters and Islamic practice is, in Indonesia, not a question of artistic sensitivity or cultural awareness. It is a question of what the law permits to be shown. The law does not permit Family Guy. The show has never aired there. South Korea's ban is the one that carries the most irony, and it has been noted in multiple places for exactly that reason. South Korea is one of the countries where Family Guy's animation is actually produced. The physical work of creating the show, the drawing, the coloring, the animation itself, is done in part by South Korean studios. The country's animators have spent years working on a show that their own country has decided its citizens cannot watch. The ban in South Korea is for offensiveness and indecency, the same broad category as Vietnam and Indonesia. But the fact that the labor producing the show and the prohibition on watching the show exist in the same country is a detail that says something specific about how global entertainment production actually works, and how disconnected the business of making something can be from the question of whether that thing is appropriate. India's relationship with Family Guy is more complicated than a simple ban. The show has aired in India, on Star World Premiere, but with significant restrictions and an age rating that has changed over time. Reports consistently list India among the countries that have taken action against the show, though the nature of that action has varied. India's broadcast environment is shaped by a mix of religious sensitivities across multiple faiths, cultural conservatism around sexual content, and regulatory bodies that have historically moved to restrict content considered inappropriate for general audiences. Family Guy has generated complaints and restrictions in India for all of those reasons. Malaysia and Taiwan are listed among the countries that have banned the show for offensiveness and indecency. The Philippines appears on the same list for similar reasons. South Africa's relationship with Family Guy is also documented as a prohibition, though the specific reasoning cited in most reporting falls under the same general category of content deemed too offensive or indecent for broadcast. Venezuela's ban is the one with the most specific documented history. Venezuela banned Family Guy in 2008, and the action was taken under the government of Hugo Chavez, who was, at the time, pursuing a broader agenda of restricting American cultural content in Venezuelan media. The ban was framed around the show being a potentially bad influence on children, which is a notable framing for a show that airs at 9 p.m. and carries a TV-14 rating. The irony is that The Simpsons, which was mentioned in the same context as Family Guy, and which Venezuelan regulators also took action against, is by almost every measure a tamer show. Family Guy is more extreme in its content, but The Simpsons is older, more famous, and in some ways more embedded in Venezuelan cultural awareness. Both shows were caught in the same regulatory sweep. What connects all of these bans, across countries that share almost nothing else in terms of culture, government, religion, or history, is the show's consistent refusal to treat anything as off-limits. Family Guy does not have a category of content it avoids out of respect for any group, any belief system, or any country. It mocks Christianity. It mocks Islam. It mocks Judaism. It mocks gay people and transgender people. It mocks Muslim-majority countries and their cultures. It mocks the Holocaust. It mocks disability. It mocks domestic violence, addiction, race, nationality, and death. The show's position, demonstrated through 20-plus seasons of behavior, is that everything is material. That position is sustainable in the United States, where the First Amendment creates extremely broad protections for speech, and where the tradition of using comedy to challenge social boundaries has a long history. American audiences have been trained over decades to understand shows like Family Guy as operating within a specific comedic tradition that requires the audience to apply its own judgment about what is actually being endorsed versus what is being made fun of. The show is offensive, but it is offensively equal. It does not single out one group, one religion, or one country for mockery that it does not also apply to others, including Americans themselves. But that American framework does not travel with the show. The countries that banned Family Guy are not applying American standards of free speech or American ideas about the relationship between comedy and offense. They are applying their own standards, developed within their own histories and their own value systems. Egypt's broadcast regulators are not wrong, by Egyptian standards, to find Family Guy incompatible with Egyptian moral requirements. Iran's government is not applying an incoherent logic when it bans a show with gay characters from a country that criminalizes homosexuality. Indonesia is not being unreasonable by its own regulatory framework when it decides that a show mocking Islamic practice cannot air in a country where Islam shapes public life. The collision between Family Guy and these countries is not a collision between comedy and humorlessness. It is a collision between one country's ideas about what is permitted and another country's ideas about what is permitted. The show wins that collision at home. It loses it everywhere else on the list. The Arabic dub is the most striking example of what happens when a country tries to split the difference, to air the show without banning it, but to make it into something different enough to be acceptable. Al-Majd TV aired a version of Family Guy in Arabic, in which all instrumental music was removed, because music is considered off-limits in some interpretations of Islamic practice. Scenes showing Quagmire using his left hand were flipped so that he appeared to be using his right hand, because the left hand carries negative associations in Islamic tradition. Content considered offensive or contrary to Islamic values was cut or replaced. The result was still called Family Guy. It still featured the Griffin family, but the version being broadcast was not the version that Seth MacFarlane made. It was a reconstruction, the same skeleton dressed in completely different clothes. This is actually one of the more revealing things that any country has done in response to the show. The Arabic dub does not say Family Guy is too offensive to exist. It says Family Guy is too offensive to exist in its current form, and then it rebuilds the current form into something it can work with. The effort required to do that, to go through every episode, remove the music, flip the hand use scenes, cut the offensive content, is enormous. The fact that a broadcaster went to that effort rather than simply not airing the show at all suggests that there was genuine demand for the content, that audiences wanted to watch it, and that the solution to the conflict between that demand and the country's broadcast standards was to remake the show into something that satisfied both. The United States, meanwhile, has its own version of this conversation. The Parents Television Council, a conservative nonprofit group that monitors American television, has declared Family Guy the worst primetime show for family viewing in 2000, 2005, and 2006. It has listed over 40 individual Family Guy episodes as the worst television show of the week over the course of the show's run. It has filed formal complaints with the Federal Communications Commission about the show. It has asked the show's advertisers, companies like Wrigley and Burger King, to pull their advertising because their products appeal to children and the show's content is inappropriate. None of this stopped the show. The FCC complaints did not remove it from air. The advertiser pressure did not shut it down. America's version of a Family Guy ban looks like a strongly worded letter that the network files away and ignores. The rest of the world's version looks like a law. Both responses tell you something true about the show. The FCC complaints tell you that even within the country that created it and protects it, Family Guy makes enough people uncomfortable enough to generate organized opposition across 20-plus years. The bans tell you that the discomfort does not have to reach that level of organization to produce consequences. It just has to exist in a country where the regulatory system is willing to act on it.
The show that got banned across 2 billion people's home countries did not change its approach in response. It kept going. It added more countries to the list. It gave Meg a musical number in Russia. It put the Holocaust in a buddy comedy. It made a Muslim character a terrorist, and then got its most controversial episode pulled from streaming for 9 years after a real bombing. __quote _for __. And somewhere in all of that, it also found time to make a very specific joke about Germany's missing years, to mock Ireland's entire civilization with a bottle of whiskey, and to send Peter to France to shout insults from the top of the Eiffel Tower. The France episode is quieter than most of what this essay has covered so far. No bans, no government officials, no conspiracy theories. Just one man standing at the top of the most famous landmark in the world, shouting into a microphone about what he thinks of French cinema. It turns out that is enough. Section 6. Germany again. Road to Germany and the Holocaust as comedy setting. The first time Family Guy went to Germany, it lasted about 90 seconds. Brian found the gap in the pamphlet. The tour guide did the Nazi salute. The bus moved on. Munich disappeared out the window. The episode continued on to Vatican City, Amsterdam, and eventually London, and Germany was just one stop among many. A quick joke about denial, a salute, a beer hall reference, and then gone. The whole sequence was designed to get in and out fast, to land the joke before the audience had time to think too hard about what the joke was actually doing. That is a skill Family Guy has always had. Hit the nerve and keep moving. Do not let the camera linger long enough for the discomfort to fully settle. The second time Family Guy went to Germany, it stayed for an entire episode. Road to Germany is the third episode of Season 7. It aired on October 26, 2008. It was written by Patrick Meighan, who had previously written Road to Rupert, another episode in the Road to series. The Road to episodes are a specific tradition within Family Guy. Episodes built around Brian and Stewie going somewhere together, usually through some accidental or chaotic chain of events, and having to find their way back. The format comes from a series of films made in the 1940s starring Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, where the two comedians would travel to exotic locations and get into trouble. Family Guy uses the format as an excuse to send its two most verbally sharp characters somewhere unusual and let them interact with whatever they find there. What they find in Road to Germany is the Holocaust. The setup begins at the Griffin House on Oscar night. The neighbors are watching the Academy Awards together. Mort Goldman, the show's recurring Jewish character, has taken laxatives and urgently needs a bathroom. He runs into Stewie's room and mistakes the time machine for a portable toilet. He climbs in, the door closes, the machine activates. By the time Brian and Stewie realize what has happened and go back to retrieve him, Mort has been transported to Warsaw, Poland on September 1st, 1939. That date is specific, and the show knows it is specific. September 1st, 1939 is the day Nazi Germany invaded Poland. It is the date that most historians mark as the beginning of the Second World War in Europe. Mort arrives in the middle of a Jewish wedding in Warsaw and initially believes he has died and gone to heaven because he recognizes some of the people around him as relatives who are no longer alive in his present. The moment he is in, the wedding, the community, the warmth is about to be destroyed. The German invasion is hours away. The show lets Mort exist in that warmth for just long enough to establish what is about to be lost before the tanks start rolling. This is the single most cinematically aware moment in the episode. The wedding sequence is played almost completely straight. There is no joke in it. The community gathered in that Warsaw synagogue is alive and joyful and entirely unaware of what is coming, and the show allows that to exist without undercutting it. Viewers who have written about this episode note that the opening Warsaw sequence is genuinely moving, that it captures something about the specific, fragile nature of that historical moment in a way that a comedy show has no business being able to do. One viewer wrote that they could not watch the first few minutes of the Polish segment without becoming emotional, and that for all that has been created to try and capture what happened during that period, the opening time travel scene of the festive Jewish wedding on September 1st, 1939,
Being interrupted by what comes next is something that stays with you. And then the rest of the episode happens. Brian and Stewie arrive in Warsaw to retrieve Mort. They quickly understand where and when they are. They cannot return to the present because the return pad that powers the time machine is depleted and needs uranium to recharge. The only accessible source of uranium in 1939 is a nuclear research facility in Berlin, in Nazi Germany. They have to go to Berlin. To get there, they need to get through Nazi-controlled territory. They join the Royal Air Force and fly a bombing mission over Germany. Stewie, in the aircraft, says to Brian, "Talk to me, Goose," a reference to the 1986 film Top Gun. The bomber gets hit. They survive the crash. They reach Berlin. In Berlin, Stewie disguises himself as Adolf Hitler. Brian and Mort dress as Nazi officers. Stewie walks into the nuclear research facility in Hitler's uniform and is greeted like a celebrity because to everyone in the facility, he appears to be the most powerful man in Germany. He obtains the uranium rod from a scientist who is depicted as a parody of a famous Coca-Cola advertisement featuring former NFL player Mean Joe Green. In the original ad, Green tosses his jersey to a young fan. Here, he tosses a uranium rod to Stewie in the same gesture. The show treats this as a funny reference. The scene is set in Nazi Germany's weapons program. Then the real Hitler shows up. Stewie, disguised as Hitler, comes face to face with the actual Hitler. The two of them mirror each other's movements in a scene that the show builds as a reference to a famous scene from Duck Soup, a 1933 comedy film by the Marx Brothers, in which two characters who look identical mirror each other through a doorway. Hitler orders their execution. Stewie and Brian break into a comedy routine to buy time, a musical number, the kind of set piece that the Road 2 episodes are known for, while Mort gets the uranium into the return pad. They escape back to the present. The episode ends with Stewie using his time machine to erase the version of events the audience just watched. He kills the Mort who traveled with them by shoving him back into the machine and then destroying the machine with a ray gun. The original Mort, the one who never took his laxative-fueled wrong turn, walks into the room 30 seconds before the whole thing started. He ends up using the bathroom in a more conventional and much less dignified way. The Holocaust adventure is erased. Nobody remembers it. The timeline resets. The critical response to Road to Germany was strongly positive. IGN gave it a 9.6 out of 10 and called it one of the best episodes of the show in years. The reviewer praised what he described as hilariously offensive humor and noted the quality of the animation, which the episode spent more money on than a typical installment. TV Guide was more critical, calling it a slight step back after a strong run of episodes in Season 7. But the overall reception leaned toward appreciation rather than condemnation. The episode received an Emmy Award nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009. Seth MacFarlane confirmed that Road to Germany was one of 3 episodes the show submitted for that award, alongside I Dream of Jesus and Family Gay. Getting nominated for Outstanding Comedy Series is not a small thing. It is the award that goes to the best comedy on television in a given year. The nomination was a signal from the television industry that Road to Germany, whatever else it was considered excellent work by the people who evaluate excellence in American television. This creates a genuinely interesting tension. The same episode that places a Jewish character inside the Holocaust as an adventure backdrop, that uses Adolf Hitler as a prop for a Marx Brothers reference, that puts Stewie Griffin in a Hitler costume and plays it for laughs, that treats Auschwitz-era Berlin as a setting for a buddy comedy, received recognition from the Television Academy as one of the best things on American television that year. Both of those things are true at the same time. The episode is offensive by almost any reasonable definition of the word, and the television industry gave it a nomination for excellence. What holds those two things together is craft. Road to Germany is not a thoughtless episode. The Warsaw wedding sequence demonstrates that the writers understood the weight of what they were approaching. The animation is above the show's standard quality. The references, Top Gun, Duck Soup, Back to the Future, Star Wars, are layered and precise. The Brian and Mort dynamic in the episode is genuinely funny in ways that depend on character rather than just shock. The show is doing real work here, not just pointing at the Holocaust and waiting for the discomfort to generate a reaction. But craft does not resolve the central question the episode raises. The question is whether the Holocaust, a specific, documented historical event in which 6 million Jewish people were murdered along with millions of others, can be the setting for a comedy adventure story, no matter how well made that story is. The episode's answer is yes.
Its reasoning, demonstrated through the choices it makes rather than stated directly, seems to be that comedy has always engaged with darkness, that distance and absurdity can be ways of approaching what is too heavy to approach directly, and that the Warsaw wedding sequence earns the show the right to what comes after it. That reasoning works for some viewers and not for others. There is no way to make it work for everyone, and the show does not try. Family Guy has never operated on the principle of universal acceptance. It makes the choice, it lives with the response, and it moves forward. The erasure at the end is what stays with you longest if you think about the episode after it is over. Stewie resets the timeline. The Holocaust adventure never happened. The Mort who experienced it, who screamed in the middle of Nazi-occupied Europe that he hated everything and everyone, who broke down completely in a way the show almost never lets its characters break down. That version of Mort is gone, erased, replaced by the original Mort, who knows nothing and remembers nothing, and ends up with a much more ordinary problem in Stewie's room. The reset is funny. It is also the show refusing consequence. Every episode of Family Guy essentially resets. The events of one episode rarely carry into the next, and characters do not develop in lasting ways as a result of what happens to them week to week. That is a standard feature of the show's structure, not specific to this episode. But in an episode where the consequence being erased is a Jewish character's experience of Nazi-occupied Europe, the reset lands differently than it does in episodes about, say, Meg getting a boyfriend or Peter buying a boat. The show erased Mort's experience because keeping it would require the show to carry it. It would require acknowledging that what happened in those 30 minutes mattered in a way that outlasted the episode's runtime. Family Guy has never been willing to do that. The adventure happened. The joke was made. The timeline was reset. Everyone is fine. Germany did not formally respond to Road to Germany. No ban followed. No government complaint was filed. The episode aired, received critical recognition, got an Emmy nomination, and became one of the more discussed entries in the Road to catalog. German viewers who encountered it through fan communities and streaming made the same observation that comes up with the British episodes and the Russia episode. The show reduces a country and its history to the single most extreme version of that history, without any interest in what else the country is or has become. But Germany's specific situation is different from Britain's dental jokes or Russia's crumbling buildings. The history being mined for comedy in Road to Germany is not a quirk or a stereotype. It is a catastrophe. The 6 years that the pamphlet leaves blank are not blank because the tour guide is embarrassed. They are blank in the pamphlet's joke because the show needed a simple visual representation of denial. But those 6 years contain the murder of millions of people. When the show puts a cartoon character in a Hitler costume and plays it for laughs, it is using that murder as a prop. Whether that is acceptable depends on a set of values about what comedy can and cannot do that the show has never asked its audience to examine out loud. The show just does it, and the audience either laughs or does not, and the episode ends, and Mort forgets everything. __quote_5___. What this next France episode reveals, collectively, is that Family Guy has a consistent approach to famous places. Landmarks become punchline locations. Famous monuments become the backdrop for someone else's joke. The Eiffel Tower is not interesting to the show as a structure with a history and a meaning. It is interesting as the tallest thing available in Paris, which makes it the best possible amplification system for Peter's film criticism. Section 7. France. The Eiffel Tower Dispatch. There is a specific kind of confidence required to stand at the top of the most famous landmark in the world and shout insults at the country that built it. Peter Griffin does not have that confidence. Peter Griffin has something better, which is the complete absence of self-awareness that makes confidence unnecessary. He does not need to feel brave about what he is doing, because it does not occur to him that what he is doing requires bravery. He simply has a message he wants delivered to France,
and the Eiffel Tower is the most logical delivery point, and so that is where the message gets delivered. The logistics make sense to Peter. The audacity of it does not register. The episode is called Welcome Back, Carter. It is from Season 9 of Family Guy, which aired in 2010. The plot centers on Peter discovering that his father-in-law, Carter Pewterschmidt, has been having an affair. Peter uses this information to make Carter do whatever he wants, turning the wealthiest and most powerful man in Quahog into his personal assistant. Carter, who has spent the entire run of the show treating Peter with open contempt, is forced to comply with Peter's requests because the alternative is Peter telling Carter's wife Babs about the affair. Peter's requests are specific and strange. He makes Carter carry heavy televisions. He makes Carter confirm out loud that Peter is the best and most awesome. He makes Carter admit that Peter makes better laser sounds than he does. These are the requests of a man who has never had power over anyone and is using his first taste of it to settle the most personal and petty scores imaginable. And then Peter sends Carter to France. The instruction is simple. Peter wants Carter to fly to France, go to the top of the Eiffel Tower, and deliver a message to the French people. The message is this: a good-looking, depressed guy smoking a cigarette is not a movie. That is the whole joke. That is Peter Griffin's one grievance with France, the single cultural criticism he has been waiting for the right moment to express, the complaint he decided was important enough to require international delivery from the top of a landmark. French art house cinema, a style of filmmaking that has been made in France since the 1950s and 1960s, characterized by slow pacing, philosophical themes, and a visual style that prioritizes mood over plot, has a reputation in American popular culture for being pretentious and difficult. The stereotype is that French films involve attractive people being sad in beautiful locations, usually while smoking, and that this is considered profound art in France, while American audiences find it confusing and dull. Peter's complaint captures that stereotype in a single sentence. A good-looking depressed guy smoking a cigarette is not a movie. It is blunt in the way Peter is always blunt, which is to say it is not trying to be a sophisticated critique. It is not engaging with French cinema on its own terms or acknowledging any of its actual qualities. It is a man who has probably never seen a French film explaining why French films are bad, using the most reductive possible description of what a French film is. Carter delivers the message from the top of the Eiffel Tower, speaking into a microphone so the crowd below can hear him. He relays Peter's words. And then, because Carter is Carter, a man who has his own opinions about everything and no patience for restraint, he adds his own grievance. He tells the people of France that their sirens sound like gay guys having a threesome. The French siren has a sound that is genuinely different from the American siren. The American siren has a consistent wail. The French siren has a two-tone alternating sound, a high note and a lower note, cycling back and forth, that has a different rhythm and a different feeling. Carter's description of that sound is crude and specific in the way Family Guy descriptions of things always are. The joke is not really about France. It is about Carter being unable to control himself even when he is supposed to be delivering someone else's message. He completes his assignment and then immediately editorializes, because that is who Carter is. Peter's response to Carter's addition: on your mark, get set, terrible. That is the end of the French sequence. The show moves on. France does not respond. The Eiffel Tower remains standing. French cinema continues to be made. The two-tone siren continues to cycle through its sound. Nothing changes except that Family Guy has now delivered its verdict on French culture from the most visible possible location. And the verdict is, not a movie. And the sirens are weird. What makes the France material in Family Guy interesting to look at across the whole run of the show is not the Eiffel Tower scene specifically. That scene is funny and quick and does not pretend to be anything more than a quick joke. What is interesting is how many times the show returned to Paris and France across different seasons, and what those returns reveal about what the show actually thinks of the place. In Season 13, an episode called Lego My Mego sends Meg to France. Her friend Ruth has invited her to study abroad for a semester in Paris. This is, by Meg's standards, a remarkable opportunity, a chance to leave Quahog, to do something that most people in her life would not expect of her, to be somewhere new. The show does not allow this to go well. while in Paris, Meg and Ruth are kidnapped. The city that is supposed to represent expansion and experience for Meg becomes the setting for her victimization.
Brian and Stewie have to travel to Paris to rescue her. The episode uses Paris as an adventure backdrop in a way that is structurally similar to what Road to Germany does with Nazi-occupied Berlin. The city is a location for something to go wrong in, not a place with its own character that the show is interested in exploring. Paris in Lego My Mego is a backdrop for a kidnapping plot, which tells you exactly as much about Paris as the Eiffel Tower scene tells you about French cinema, which is to say, almost nothing. In Season 9, the same season as Welcome Back, Kotter, an episode called Foreign Affairs sends Lois and Bonnie to Paris together. Bonnie, Joe Swanson's wife, has invited Lois along on a trip, and Lois accepts before discovering that Bonnie's actual reason for going is to have an affair. The episode uses Paris as the location where Bonnie almost destroys her marriage, which is a specific choice.
Paris has a cultural reputation as a romantic city, a place associated with love and passion and the kind of experiences that seem more possible there than anywhere else. The show uses that reputation as the setup for a story about infidelity, taking the idea of Paris as a place where things happen and applying it to something that puts a marriage at risk. Lois talks Bonnie out of the affair. The two of them do some sightseeing in a sequence that the show renders as a Muppets parody. The characters appear in Muppet form, visiting the Louvre, the Arc de Triomphe, and the Eiffel Tower. It is a genuinely odd visual choice, and it has nothing to do with France specifically. It is a pop culture reference that uses Paris landmarks as its backdrop. The Louvre and the Arc de Triomphe are not jokes. They are just locations that happen to be in the shot while the show makes a joke about something else entirely.
Season 11 brought the episode called The Stowaway, in which Quagmire travels to Paris and ends up having to babysit Stewie, who hid in his suitcase while playing hide-and-seek with Brian. Stewie sees the character Madeline, the little girl from the famous children's book series set in Paris, and decides to follow her, gets separated from Quagmire, and gets lost in the city. Brian has to come to Paris to help find him. Paris, again, is the place where the show's characters go to have problems that require other characters to come rescue them from. None of these episodes are about France. They are all set in France, and they all use French locations as visual markers to establish that the characters are somewhere other than Quahog, but the country itself is not what any of them are interested in. France functions as a setting the way a hotel room functions as a setting. It provides a location for the action, and the specifics of the location occasionally generate a joke, but the action itself could happen in a different location without changing much. This is actually a different relationship than the show has with some of the other countries it covers. Britain gets specific recurring jokes. Germany gets a specific recurring historical reference. Russia got a specific episode with a specific song and a specific political context. France gets used as a location repeatedly, without the show ever developing a consistent point of view about it, beyond the Eiffel Tower scene's one-sentence critique of French cinema. The Welcome Back, Kotter scene is the clearest expression of what Family Guy actually thinks about France, and what it thinks is, French art house films are self-indulgent, French sirens sound funny, and both of these observations are worth shouting from the Eiffel Tower. That is not a sophisticated critique. It is also not trying to be. Peter Griffin is not a film critic. He is not a cultural observer. He is a man who formed an opinion about French movies at some point, probably based on seeing a clip or a parody of one, and decided that opinion needed to be aired at maximum volume from the most recognizable structure on Earth. The joke works because of the gap between the location and the message. The Eiffel Tower is one of the most visited monuments in the world. It was built between 1887 and 1889 as the entrance arch for the 1889 World Fair in Paris. It is 330 meters tall. It receives millions of visitors every year. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most significant structures human beings have ever built. And Peter Griffin is using it as a platform to complain about foreign films. That gap between the grandeur of the location and the pettiness of the message is where the comedy lives. Family Guy has always understood that comedy can be generated by putting something very small in a very large frame, or something very large in a very small frame. Peter's film critique is a very small thing. The Eiffel Tower is a very large frame.
The mismatch does the work. France, as a country, did not respond to any of this. There was no French government statement about Welcome Back Carter. There was no organized protest from French cultural institutions about the characterization of French cinema. The episode aired, the joke landed, and France continued producing films about good-looking, depressed people smoking cigarettes. Because French cinema has been doing that for decades, and a cartoon complaint from Rhode Island was not going to change anything. This is the pattern that the France material fits into. The countries that respond officially and loudly versus the countries that do not respond at all. Russia responded officially through a government deputy calling it information warfare. The Muslim world responded through bans across multiple countries. Germany did not respond officially, but drew critical commentary from viewers. Britain shrugged. France, so far as any public record shows, did not notice. The absence of a response is not the same as the absence of offense. It is possible to be offended without organizing a response. It is possible for people in France to find the Eiffel Tower scene reductive and then change the channel without filing a formal complaint. Most offense does not become a news story. Most offense is just absorbed, noted, felt, and set aside. Because organizing a response requires effort and conviction that most people do not apply to a cartoon. What the France episodes reveal, collectively, is that Family Guy has a consistent approach to famous places. Landmarks become punchline locations. Famous monuments become the backdrop for someone else's joke. The Eiffel Tower is not interesting to the show as a structure with a history and a meaning. It is interesting as the tallest thing available in Paris, which makes it the best possible amplification system for Peter's film criticism. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next country on the list is one that Peter Griffin has a personal connection to. One the show treats with something that almost looks like fondness, right up until it decides that the single greatest thing that country ever produced was an accident that immediately caused a riot. Ireland is next, and warmth, it turns out, is its own particular kind of insult. Section 8. Ireland. Whiskey, Riots, and Peter's Heritage. Peter Griffin is Irish-American. This is not incidental. It is built into the character from the beginning. Peter's last name is Griffin, which is an Irish surname. His family history is rooted in Ireland. Seth MacFarlane, the man who created Peter and who voices him, is himself part Irish. The connection between Peter and Ireland is not the show reaching for a random target. It is the show turning on one of its own, using the Irish heritage of its main character as the entry point for a sustained joke about what that heritage actually consists of. The episode is called Peter Griffin, Husband, Father, Brother, and it is from Season 4. The specific sequence that concerns us begins when Peter decides that Chris needs to learn more about his family roots. The solution Peter arrives at is a visit to an Irish heritage museum. This is, by Peter's standards, a responsible parenting decision. He has identified a gap in his son's education. Chris does not know where he comes from, and he has found a cultural institution specifically designed to fill that gap. The logic is sound. The execution is Family Guy. The museum exists to teach visitors about Irish history and Irish identity. What it teaches, in the version the show presents, is a very specific and very compressed account of what Ireland is and has always been. The exhibit begins with Irish men. Irish men, the museum explains, spend their days at the pub. This is presented not as a stereotype to be examined, but as a historical fact to be absorbed. The kind of foundational information you would put in the first room of a heritage museum, because everything else builds on it. Before you can understand Ireland, you need to understand the pub. The pub is where Irish men are. This is where they have always been. This is where they will continue to be. Irish women, the museum continues, pray babies into existence. The joke here is about the combination of Catholic religiosity and high birth rates that has historically been associated with Ireland, collapsed into a single absurd image. Irish women do not have children through any normal process. They pray and children appear. The mechanism is faith. The output is babies. That is the entirety of Irish womanhood as the museum presents it. Then the museum does something unexpected. It introduces Irish scientists. This is the pivot that makes the sequence work.
The first two exhibits, men at the pub, women praying babies into existence, are standard stereotype delivery. Anyone who has ever heard an Irish joke has encountered some version of both. The audience knows where those jokes go before they arrive. But scientists are not part of the standard Irish stereotype package. Scientists suggest achievement. Scientists suggest that the museum is about to complicate the picture, to add something that does not fit the simple caricature. The complication arrives. Ireland, it turns out, was once extraordinarily advanced. The museum presents a version of Irish scientific history in which the country was so far ahead of the rest of the world that it made the technology depicted in The Jetsons, a 1960s American animated show set in a future full of flying cars, robot maids, and automated everything, look primitive by comparison. Ireland had achieved things that the rest of human civilization would not reach for generations. And then, the scientists invented whiskey. The sequence shows the scientists working, making their discovery, and then doing what the museum presents as the natural next step, drinking it. They drink approximately half a bottle between them. That is all it takes. Within moments of the first taste, the scientists are fighting. Not arguing, not debating, fighting. Physically, chaotically. The advanced civilization that was building technology beyond anything the modern world had achieved collapsed into a brawl the moment whiskey entered the picture. The riot that followed was, according to the museum's telling, likely the first of many. The Griffin boys take this in. The museum has walked them through the entire arc of Irish civilization. Achievement, invention, alcohol, chaos, and then the long continuation of the pub and prayer lifestyle that the first two exhibits established. The scientific golden age was a brief interruption. The natural state of Ireland is what the first room showed. The scientists were an anomaly. The whiskey was inevitable. Seth MacFarlane's Irish heritage is relevant here in the same way that it is relevant when the show makes jokes about American culture. The argument the show's defenders always make, and it is not a wrong argument, just an incomplete one, is that Family Guy mocks everything equally, including the backgrounds of the people who make it. MacFarlane, being part Irish, gives the Ireland jokes a quality that the Germany jokes and the Russia jokes do not have. It gives them warmth. The Ireland material in this episode does not feel hostile. It feels like someone who has heard these jokes their whole life and decided to put them on television with good humor rather than resentment. That warmth is real, and it is also, in its own way, the problem. When a joke is made with affection, it is harder to push back on. If MacFarlane were mocking Ireland from a position of contempt, the response would be simpler. You could say, "This is mean-spirited. This is punching at a country that did not ask to be targeted. This is using a culture as a punchline for cheap laughs." But when the mocking comes with a smile, when it is wrapped in the kind of familiarity that suggests the joke teller considers themselves part of the group being joked about, the response gets more complicated. Are you allowed to object to a joke that the joke teller is technically making at their own expense? The answer is yes, and the reason is that the joke is not really at the joke teller's expense. MacFarlane is not Irish in the way that people in Ireland are Irish. He is Irish-American, which means he has Irish ancestry, but grew up in America, was shaped by American culture, and experiences Irishness as a heritage rather than a daily reality. The warmth in the Ireland jokes comes from a distance, from someone who feels connected to Ireland without being accountable to it, without having to live with the effects of the stereotypes being reinforced. People who actually live in Ireland, who are actually Irish, who deal with the actual consequences of how the world perceives their country, do not necessarily find the warmth sufficient. The stereotype being reinforced in the Heritage Museum sequence, that Irish civilization peaked at whiskey and has been defined by alcohol and chaos ever since, is a stereotype with real history behind it. The association of Irish people with alcoholism has been used over centuries to dismiss and demean Irish immigrants in America and Irish people internationally. It is not a neutral observation. It carries weight. The show does not engage with that weight. It cannot engage with it, because engaging with it would require slowing down, would require treating the stereotype as something with consequences rather than something with a punchline. The Heritage Museum sequence is funny and quick and moves on. The Irish civilization rises and falls in the space of a few minutes of screen time, and the lesson Chris is supposed to take away from his Heritage Museum visit is that his ancestors were brilliant until they got drunk, and then everything went sideways. This is the version of heritage that Peter passes to his son, not the actual history of Ireland, which includes centuries of British colonial rule, the Great Famine of the 1840s in which over 1 million people died and another 1 million immigrated, the long struggle for independence, the complex religious and political divisions that shaped the country through the 20th century, and a literary and artistic tradition that produced some of the most celebrated writers in the English language. None of that is in the museum. The museum has men at the pub, women praying, scientists who invented whiskey, and a riot. The Jetsons reference is worth noting because of what it implies. The show is not saying Ireland was slightly ahead of other countries. It is saying Ireland was so far advanced that it made futuristic science fiction look outdated. The gap between that peak, civilization beyond what the modern world has achieved, and the aftermath, a pub, a prayer, a brawl, is enormous. The bigger the gap, the funnier the fall. Family Guy understands this principle deeply. The higher you build something up, the further it has to drop, and the drop is where the comedy lives. Ireland fell from the Jetsons to a bar fight and half a bottle of whiskey. That is the whole joke. And it lands because the setup, the scientists, the advanced civilization, the genuine potential, is committed to before the punchline arrives. The museum earns its punchline by making you believe, for just a moment, that something different was going to be said. Family Guy did not receive any formal Irish response to this episode. No Irish government official called it information warfare.
No Irish broadcast authority moved to restrict the show.
Ireland has continued to air Family Guy without official objection to the Heritage Museum sequence. The episode is available to stream in Ireland. The pub is still there in the joke, and the joke is still available. What Ireland did not get, and what no country that Family Guy visits ever gets, is a version of itself that exists outside the single most reductive possible frame. Ireland is whiskey and riots. Britain is bad teeth and cricket. Germany is the Nazi period. Russia is crumbling buildings and drunk residents. France is pretentious films and weird sirens. The show visits these places, makes its jokes, and leaves. The countries stay behind, continuing to be complicated and real and entirely unlike the versions that appear on screen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next stop on this particular tour is a deli counter in an American city where Peter Griffin grows a mustache and becomes convinced that facial hair has given him the ability to speak Italian. What comes out of his mouth is not Italian. It is not close to Italian. It is a sound that the show presents as Italian, and the man behind the counter, who actually speaks Italian, responds with something the show does not translate, something that the subtitles tell you is extremely specific and extremely angry. And in that untranslated response, Italy gets something that Ireland and Britain and France and Germany never quite got. Italy gets the last word. Section 9. Italy. Language as noise. Peter Griffin gets a stroke in McStroke. That is actually how the episode begins. Peter eats too many hamburgers from a fast food restaurant. The show specifies that he eats 30 hamburgers in one sitting, which is the kind of detail Family Guy commits to fully. And the consequence is a stroke that leaves one side of his face temporarily paralyzed. The episode is from season 6. It is called McStroke, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the show is treating the medical situation at the center of its plot. Peter recovers, the stroke resolves, and in the aftermath of his recovery, Peter does what Peter always does after any significant experience, which is extract from it the single most personally useful and least medically accurate lesson available. The lesson Peter extracts from his stroke is not that he should eat fewer hamburgers. It is not that he should take better care of himself. It is not even that he should spend more time with his family while he still can. The lesson Peter takes from having a stroke is that he should grow a mustache. The mustache grows. Peter studies it. He thinks about what a mustache means and what a mustache does to a man, and what possibilities a mustache opens up that a clean-shaven face forecloses. And somewhere in this process, Peter arrives at a conclusion that the episode presents with complete commitment. The mustache has given him the ability to speak Italian. He does not question this. He does not test it carefully before acting on it. He walks into a deli, approaches the man behind the counter, and begins speaking Italian to him. Except that what Peter speaks is not Italian. It is not close to Italian. It is not a failed attempt at Italian that reveals some partial knowledge of the language. It is a completely invented stream of sounds that Peter has generated from somewhere in his brain and decided, with total confidence, constitutes fluent Italian communication.
The phrase the show gave him, the specific collection of syllables that Peter produces and presents as language, is boopity-boppity. That is it. Boopity-boppity. Peter says this to the deli owner with the full conviction of a man who believes he is being understood, who believes the sounds coming out of his mouth are landing as meaningful communication, who believes that his mustache has unlocked something that was always there, waiting to be accessed. Brian is standing next to Peter through all of this. Brian speaks multiple languages and has the general cultural awareness that Peter lacks entirely. Brian watches Peter address the deli owner in boopity-boppity and immediately recognizes what is happening, which is that his friend is producing meaningless noise at a stranger and expecting that stranger to respond to it as language. Brian tries to tell Peter how ignorant he is being. He says it directly. Peter does not hear him.
Peter is too committed to the conversation he believes he is having with the deli owner to process any outside input suggesting the conversation is not what he thinks it is. The deli owner responds. This is the moment the scene turns into something more interesting than a simple joke about Peter's stupidity. The deli owner does not respond in English. He does not gently explain to Peter that what he said was not Italian. He responds in actual Italian, real Italian, grammatically correct Italian, the language that Peter believes he has been speaking and has not come close to producing. The show provides subtitles for what the deli owner says because the audience needs to know what the response is, and the response is something the show wants you to read. The subtitles translate the deli owner's Italian as, "Are you crazy? Get out of here. I will punch you in the head and kill you with this meat." That is the full response. 3 sentences. The first questions Peter's sanity. The second removes him from the premises. The third specifies both the method of physical harm and the instrument to be used, which is the meat that the deli owner is presumably holding or standing near at the time. The response is not polite. It is not patient. It is not the response of a man who is trying to help Peter understand where he went wrong. It is the response of a man who has been subjected to something offensive and is expressing that offense in direct and specific terms. Brian notes afterward that boopity-boppity might be the most famous line from the episode, but that for anyone who actually speaks Italian, the deli owner's response is the most memorable moment. This observation is accurate, and is also the show acknowledging something it rarely acknowledges in its international material, which is that the person being mocked has a perspective worth noting. The deli owner gets the last word, not metaphorically, literally. His Italian response is the final statement in the exchange, and the show translates it so the audience can understand it, which means the audience is given access to the deli owner's actual point of view in a way that the British characters and the German tour guide and the French audience at the Eiffel Tower are never quite given. The deli owner is angry and specific and entirely correct in his anger, and the show lets him be all of those things without immediately undercutting it with another Peter joke. This matters because it is unusual. The standard Family Guy approach to international material is to set up a joke, deliver the punchline, and move on before the target of the joke can register as a full human being with a legitimate response. The Munich tour guide does the Nazi salute, and the bus moves on. Carter shouts from the Eiffel Tower, and the scene ends. Meg sings through Chelyabinsk, and the episode cuts away. In almost every case, the country being mocked does not get to answer back in a way that the show takes seriously. The Italian deli owner answers back and the show translates it, and the translation reveals that the answer is more articulate and more justified than anything Peter said. That is the closest Family Guy gets across its entire international catalog to letting the other side win.
The boopity-bappity joke works on two separate levels, and understanding both levels is important to understanding what the show is actually doing with Italy in this scene. The first level is obvious. Peter thinks he speaks Italian because he grew a mustache. Peter does not speak Italian. The humor comes from the gap between Peter's confidence and Peter's actual ability, which is a gap that appears in almost every Peter Griffin joke ever written. Peter believes things about himself that are not true, acts on those beliefs with complete conviction, and the collision between his self-image and reality is where the comedy lives. This level of the joke has nothing to do with Italy specifically. You could replace Italy with any language, and the Peter is wrong structure would function identically. The second level is more specific to Italy and to language more broadly, and it is the level that the deli owner's response illuminates. The sounds Peter produces, boopity-boppity, are not random. They are a specific kind of invented noise that sounds, to an American ear that does not speak Italian, like what Italian might sound like. They have the rhythm and the vowel sounds and the general phonetic texture that American popular culture has associated with Italian for decades. Peter is not producing pure nonsense. He is producing his internal impression of what Italian sounds like, the version of Italian that exists in American pop culture as a kind of shorthand for the whole language. That internal impression, the American idea of what Italian sounds like, is the thing the scene is actually examining. Italian has a reputation in American entertainment as an inherently funny-sounding language. The sounds of it, the expressiveness of it, the way it moves in the mouth. These things have been used as comedy material in American film and television for as long as Italian-American characters have appeared on screen. The gesture of speaking fake Italian, of producing a string of vowel-heavy invented sounds and presenting them as the language, is a joke with a long history in American comedy. Family Guy is participating in that history with boopity-boppity. Peter is not just ignorant, he is the embodiment of a specific American relationship to Italian, one in which the language is experienced primarily as a sound, a texture, a music, rather than as an actual means of communication between actual people. The joke is that Peter has absorbed this cultural impression of Italian so completely that he believes it constitutes fluency. He has confused the noise with the language. The deli owner is the corrective. He speaks the actual language, and the actual language is angry and specific and has nothing to do with boopity-boppity. The contrast between what Peter produces and what the deli owner produces is the scene's real joke, underneath the obvious Peter is stupid joke. One man has a sound, the other man has a language. The show knows the difference even if Peter does not. The phrase boopity-boppity entered the informal catalog of Family Guy references that fans carry with them. It is one of those lines that people who watch the show quote to each other as a marker of shared familiarity, a shorthand that signals you know the show well enough to know the scene and the episode and the context. The fact that it is not a real word or phrase, that it has no meaning in any language, is part of what makes it quotable. It is pure sound, which is exactly what the joke says Italian is to Peter. Italy did not respond officially to McStroke or to the boopity-boppity scene. No Italian government statement was issued, no Italian broadcast authority moved to restrict Family Guy in Italy. The show airs in Italy with a standard content rating. Italian viewers encountered the scene the same way viewers everywhere encounter Family Guy material that touches their country, with varying levels of amusement and varying levels of irritation, mostly expressed in the informal spaces where people express things about television, rather than in any official channel. What Italy got that most other countries did not get is the deli owner. A small thing in the context of everything this show has done, but a real thing. A character who belongs to the country being mocked, who speaks the actual language of that country, who responds to the mockery with something specific and justified, and whose response the show translates so the audience can understand it. The country got to talk back. Most countries do not get that. __quote _8 __. What comes next involves a country that does not talk back, because the joke is not about something the country did, but about something the country's government decided, a policy that shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people, and that Family Guy reduces to a single cutaway gag that ends before the full weight of what it is referencing has time to land. China is next, and the joke is fast and grim and built on something real enough that the speed of it is part of the problem. Section 10. China. Policy as punchline. Death has a problem in Grumpy Old Man. Not an existential problem, which would be unusual for the character whose entire existence is defined by endings. A practical problem. Death, the physical embodiment of mortality in the Family Guy universe, gets into a fatal car crash. This is the kind of joke the show builds entire cutaway gags around, taking something that should be impossible and playing it completely straight. Death cannot die. And yet, here he is, in a car crash, facing the consequences. A figure appears to him. This figure is identified in the episode as Super Death, which is the logical extension of the show's approach to this kind of bit. If death exists as a character, then the thing that comes for death must also exist, and it must be called Super Death, because Family Guy does not leave that kind of gap unfilled. Super Death informs Death that he is about to be reincarnated. Death is going to come back. He is going to return to the living world in a new form. In the form he is going to return in, Super Death tells him, is a Chinese child. The reincarnation happens. Death becomes the Chinese child. And then, almost immediately, the child dies. The reason the child dies is the punchline. Death came back with one too many X chromosomes. In biological terms, this means Death was reincarnated as a girl. And in the China the show is depicting, a China operating under the one-child policy, a China in which the birth of a daughter rather than a son was, for many families, a source of devastation rather than celebration. Being reincarnated as a girl is a death sentence. The cutaway ends. The show moves on. That is the complete scene. It takes less time to watch than it takes to describe. Death, reincarnated as a Chinese girl, dies because she is a Chinese girl. The joke is complete in a handful of seconds. Family Guy has covered one of the most complex and painful demographic and human rights issues in modern Chinese history in the time it takes to read a paragraph. The one-child policy was a real policy. It was introduced by the Chinese government in 1980 and remained in effect until 2015, when it was replaced by a two-child policy. The policy restricted most families in China to having only one child, with exceptions for rural families whose first child was a girl, ethnic minorities, and other specific circumstances. The policy was enforced through a combination of financial penalties, social pressure, and in some documented cases, forced measures that have been the subject of significant international criticism. The consequences of the policy on gender are documented and real. In Chinese culture, as in many cultures throughout history, sons have traditionally been preferred over daughters for a combination of economic, cultural, and practical reasons. Sons were expected to carry on the family name, to provide financial support for aging parents, and to inherit family property. Daughters, in the traditional framework, would marry into another family and become that family's responsibility. When a family is limited to one child, and that one child is a daughter, the traditional calculus produces a devastating outcome for girls. The documented consequences include a gender imbalance that became one of the most studied demographic phenomena of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. China's male-to-female ratio became significantly skewed toward males. The reasons included sex-selective practices that the Chinese government has consistently worked to address through legislation and enforcement, though the effectiveness of those efforts has varied. The human cost of the gender imbalance, to the girls who were affected, to the families who navigated an impossible situation created by government policy, to the society that had to reckon with a generation shaped by these circumstances, is not a small thing. It is the thing Family Guy makes a cutaway gag out of. The Watch Mojo breakdown of the show's international material describes this scene as grim, even by Family Guy standards.
That is a notable description coming from a source that covers the show's international content broadly and has seen all of it. For something to register as grim by Family Guy standards, it has to clear a bar that the show has spent 20-plus seasons establishing. The bar includes Holocaust jokes, terrorist plots played for comedy, and a musical number set in a city the show depicts as a nuclear wasteland. The Chinese reincarnation cutaway clears that bar. What makes it grim in a specific way is the compression. The one-child policy is not a simple subject. It touches on government control over private life, on cultural attitudes toward gender that developed over thousands of years, on the collision between a government's attempt to manage a massive population and the individual human consequences of that management, on the experiences of hundreds of millions of families who navigated it in real time. Scholars have written entire books about it. Documentarians have made films about it. Journalists have spent careers covering its effects. Family Guy covers it in the time it takes death to be reincarnated and immediately die again. The speed is the joke's primary tool. The faster the cutaway, the less time the audience has to fully process what is being referenced before the punchline lands. Family Guy has always understood that speed is a form of protection. If you move fast enough, the audience laughs before they have time to feel uncomfortable, and by the time the discomfort arrives, the show is already somewhere else. The Chinese reincarnation cutaway is a masterclass in this technique. The setup is death getting into a car crash. The pivot is super death and reincarnation. The punchline is the wrong chromosomes. The whole thing is over before the audience has time to think, wait, this is about female infanticide. Because that is what it is about. Not entirely, and not in the most extreme version of the term. The show is not depicting the most graphic possible outcome. But the joke's logic depends entirely on the understanding that being born as a girl in one-child policy China carries a specific and documented risk of not surviving. Remove that understanding and the joke does not work. The punchline only lands if the audience knows, at some level, what the joke is pointing at. This creates an odd relationship between the joke and its audience. To find it funny, you have to know enough about the one-child policy and its consequences to understand the reference. But knowing that much about the one-child policy means knowing that the subject underneath the joke involves real children and real families and real loss. The joke asks you to hold both pieces of information simultaneously: the awareness that makes the punchline legible and the detachment that makes it possible to laugh at. Some audiences can hold both. Some cannot. The Watch Mojo description, grim even by Family Guy standards, suggests that even viewers who are generally comfortable with the show's approach to dark material found this particular cutaway sitting in a different register than usual. The show's own commentary on the scene, through the Watch Mojo analysis, acknowledges that the joke is grounded in real-world tragedy. This acknowledgement is honest and also insufficient, because acknowledging that a joke is grounded in real-world tragedy does not resolve the question of whether that grounding is being treated with appropriate care. The show acknowledges the reality and then uses it as a punchline anyway, which is Family Guy's consistent approach, but which lands differently when the reality being acknowledged involves the deaths of children. China, as a country, did not officially respond to the grumpy old man cutaway. The scene is too brief and too contained to generate the kind of sustained attention that the Russia episode or the Turban Cowboy episode generated. It is a moment within a larger episode, not the subject of the episode itself. It does not name a specific city. It does not involve a musical number. It does not coincide with a real-world event. It is 30 seconds of animation that references a government policy and its human consequences, and then moves on. China's relationship with Western entertainment is complex and has become more regulated over time. Chinese authorities have moved to restrict foreign content in various ways across different periods. Family Guy does not appear to have an official broadcast history in China, which means the question of a formal response to specific episodes is somewhat different than it is for countries where the show has aired and then been pulled or restricted. The show was not available in China in the way it was available in Russia or the United Kingdom, so the Chinese government's response to its content is less a matter of restricting something that was airing and more a matter of the show simply not being part of the broadcast landscape to begin with. What exists instead is the joke itself, floating in the international media environment that the internet creates, available to be found by anyone looking for it. Chinese viewers who have encountered the scene through online platforms have responded in the informal ways that international audiences respond to Family Guy material, with a range of reactions that includes finding it funny, finding it offensive, finding it accurate about the policy's consequences in a way that is uncomfortable to acknowledge, and finding it reductive in a way that is easy to identify even without formal criticism.
The one-child policy ended in 2015. China moved to a two-child policy and later to a three-child policy as the government began dealing with the long-term demographic consequences of a generation shaped by the original restriction. The gender imbalance that the policy contributed to is a documented feature of China's population that researchers and policymakers continue to address. The human experiences that sit underneath those statistics, the families, the choices, the losses, are ongoing realities for people who lived through the policy period. Family Guy made a cutaway about it and moved on to whatever came next in Grumpy Old Man. That is the full extent of the show's engagement with one of the most significant government policies affecting human life in the 20th century. A reincarnation, a wrong chromosome, a quick death. Grim, even by Family Guy standards. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next country on this tour requires a different kind of attention, because the joke the show makes there is not about a government policy, or a historical event, or a cultural stereotype that has been in circulation for decades. It is about something the characters see when they look out the window. A single image that the show uses to represent an entire country of over 1 billion people. The characters are looking for God in the Season 12, Episode 3, Acts of God, and India is one of the places they check. What they find there, and what the show decides that finding means about the entire country, is the next thing to look at closely. Section 11. India. The Sanitation Reduction. The characters are looking for God. That is the actual premise of 3 Acts of God, the 14th episode of Season 12, which aired in 2014. Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland have decided that God is personally responsible for the bad weather that keeps interfering with their football watching, and they want to find him and complain about it directly. This is a completely reasonable thing for these 4 men to do, by the internal logic of Family Guy, where God exists as a character who can be visited and argued with, and who has appeared in multiple episodes doing things that most religious institutions would find deeply objectionable. The search takes the group through several countries. They are looking for God the way you might look for a specific person who has been spotted in multiple locations, checking each place, asking around, moving on when the lead does not pan out. The episode structures itself as a tour of potential God locations, each country representing a different place where the divine might be found, each stop producing a different result. India is one of the stops. Before getting to what the show does with India in this episode, it is worth understanding what India is in terms of scale, because the scale is part of what makes the reduction so striking. India is the most populous country in the world as of recent years, having surpassed China. It has a population of over 1.5 billion people. It is home to one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth, with a history that stretches back thousands of years. It produced Sanskrit, one of the oldest written languages. It is the birthplace of 4 major world religions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. It has a film industry, centered in Mumbai, that produces more films per year than Hollywood. It has a space program that has successfully sent missions to the Moon and to Mars. It has produced Nobel Prize winners in literature, physics, economics, and peace. It has a tradition of mathematics and science that contributed concepts to the global body of knowledge that are still in use today, including the numerical system that most of the world uses, which was developed in India and transmitted to Europe through Arabic scholars. None of this is in the episode. What is in the episode is a single visual joke about sanitation. The specific content of the India scene in 3 Acts of God is described in the Watch Mojo analysis of the show's international material as the most savage burn India receives in the episode. The joke is built around the contrast between what the characters expect to find and what they actually encounter when they arrive. The expectation, presumably, is some version of India as a place, a location with streets and people and buildings and the general features of a country. What they find, in the show's depiction, is a waste problem severe enough to answer the question of whether God is there. Peter, the analysis notes, can instantly cross India off the list of places God might be found. India does have documented challenges with urban sanitation infrastructure. This is not a fabrication. The Indian government has itself identified sanitation as a national priority and launched significant public programs aimed at addressing it. The Swachh Bharat mission, which translates roughly as Clean India Mission,
was launched in 2014, the same year 3 Acts of God aired, as a government initiative specifically designed to improve sanitation access and waste management across the country. The existence of that government program acknowledges that the challenge is real. But the challenge being real is not the same as the challenge being the totality of what India is.
The gap between a documented infrastructure issue that a government is actively working to address and a comedy punchline that presents that issue as the defining characteristic of a country, the single thing worth showing when you arrive there, is the gap that Family Guy steps over without acknowledgement. Family Guy does this with every country it visits, but the India reduction has a particular texture because of the specific nature of what is being reduced. The British bad teeth jokes and the Irish whiskey jokes are built on cultural stereotypes, observations about behavior and habit that have been in circulation long enough to become recognizable shorthand. The India sanitation joke is built on an infrastructure condition, a material reality of how a developing country manages its waste, and it uses that infrastructure condition as a verdict on the entire country. The distinction matters. When you make a joke about a cultural behavior, you are at least engaging with something that people in that culture have some agency over. When you make a joke about infrastructure, you are making a joke about the consequences of poverty, historical development patterns, colonial economic structures, and the enormous challenge of building systems for 1.5 billion people. The people living with inadequate sanitation infrastructure in Indian cities did not choose that situation any more than they chose where they were born. The show does not make these distinctions. It cannot make them and maintain the speed that the cutaway gag format requires. A cutaway that stops to acknowledge the historical and economic context of Indian sanitation infrastructure is not a cutaway anymore.
It is a documentary segment, and documentaries do not err between jokes about Peter's football watching and Quagmire doing something that will get him into trouble. The format demands compression, and compression in this case means India equals this one image, and the image equals a verdict, and the verdict is delivered in the time it takes to establish a shot and cut away from it. Peter can instantly cross India off the list. God is not there. The evidence is what they see when they arrive. Next country. The episode generated controversy from a direction that was not India. A writer in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz published a piece in 2014 claiming that a scene in 3 Acts of God was evidence of long-held anti-Semitism from Seth MacFarlane. The scene in question, which is separate from the India sequence, was identified by the Haaretz writer as part of a pattern of Jewish stereotypes and anti-Jewish humor that the writer argued ran through MacFarlane's work more broadly. This is the episode that managed to generate 2 separate international controversies in 2 separate cultural directions. The India sanitation joke, drawing attention as an example of the show's reductive treatment of non-Western countries, and the separate scene drawing criticism from an Israeli publication as evidence of anti-Semitism. The 2 controversies exist entirely independently of each other. They are about different scenes in the same episode. They involve different communities responding to different content. The only thing connecting them is the episode they both came from. The Haaretz piece was not the first time Family Guy had been accused of anti-Semitic content. Australian Jewish studies writer Devir Abramovich had previously accused multiple Family Guy episodes of ridiculing Jewish people and reinforcing negative stereotypes about Jews. The show's character Mort Goldman, who is the primary Jewish character in the regular cast, has been at the center of many of these discussions. Mort is a pharmacist who is portrayed as nervous, hypochondriac, and perpetually anxious, a combination of traits that critics have identified as drawing from a long tradition of Jewish stereotypes in American entertainment. The show that went to Germany twice and used the Holocaust as an adventure backdrop, that gave its Jewish character a breakdown in Nazi-occupied Europe and then erased his memory of it, that generated accusations of anti-Semitism from multiple international critics, is the same show that used India's sanitation challenges as a punchline in the same episode that generated fresh anti-Semitism accusations from an Israeli newspaper. Family Guy's international offense record is not a list of separate incidents. It is a web of overlapping material, each piece connected to others, each controversy existing in a context that includes all the other controversies the show had already generated. India, in all of this, sits in a particular position.
It is a country that received the most compressed and dismissive treatment in an episode that was generating controversy on other fronts. The India joke did not become the headline. The Haaretz piece became the headline, at least in the publications covering it. The India sanitation reduction was noted in the Watch Mojo analysis as the most savage burn India receives in the episode, but it did not generate a formal response from any Indian government body or cultural institution. India does have a broadcasting history with Family Guy that involves restrictions. The show aired on Star World Premiere in India, but with content ratings and limitations that reflected the country's broadcast standards. India's broadcast environment is shaped by a combination of religious sensitivities across multiple faiths: Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Sikh, and cultural standards around sexual content and offensive material.
Family Guy's content has generated complaints and regulatory attention in India, though the nature and extent of official action has been less clearly documented than the outright bans in Egypt or Iran. What India did not do, and what would have required a very different kind of cultural infrastructure, is generate a response to 3 acts of God that matched the scale of what was done to it. Over 1 billion people, one of the oldest civilizations in the world, a space program, a film industry, a tradition of science and mathematics that shaped global knowledge. And the show's response to all of that is a sanitation joke that allows a character to cross the country off a list. The list of countries this show has reduced to a single punchline is long. Britain is teeth. Germany is denial and Nazism. Russia is corruption and decay. France is pretentious films. Ireland is whiskey and riots. Italy is invented noise. China is a government policy and its fatal consequences for girls. India is what you see when you get off the plane and want to know if God is there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. He is not there. The show moves on. The next section is not about what the show did to any one country. It is about what every country did in response. The full map of bans and edits and altered versions and official statements and shrugs, laid out together, because the pattern those responses form is more revealing than any single response on its own. The world watching Family Guy tells you more about the world than the show tells you about any country it visits. Section 12. Bans versus edits. What countries allow comedy to do? The show never changed. That is the first thing to understand about what the global response to Family Guy actually reveals. Across 20+ seasons, across every ban and every edit and every official complaint and every government statement and every pulled episode and every altered dub, the show itself kept going in exactly the direction it was always going. Seth MacFarlane did not soften the content after Egypt banned it. The writers did not reconsider the Muslim material after Turban Cowboy got pulled from streaming for 9 years. The Germany jokes did not disappear after the Holocaust episode received criticism. The Russia material did not get reconsidered after a government official called it information warfare. Family Guy absorbed every response the world produced and continued being exactly what it had always been. What changed was everything around it. The world watching Family Guy produced one of the most varied and revealing sets of responses that any television show has ever generated. And when you lay those responses out next to each other, the bans, the edits, the altered versions, the official complaints, the shrugs, the continued broadcasting, what you are looking at is not a record of what Family Guy did wrong. You are looking at a map of where every country on Earth has drawn its line around what comedy is allowed to do. Start with the total bans, because they represent the clearest verdict. Egypt banned Family Guy on moral and religious grounds. The ban covers the entire show, not specific episodes. Egyptian broadcast regulators looked at the show as a whole and determined that its character, its treatment of religion, its sexual content, its mockery of figures and institutions that Egyptian standards treat as deserving of respect, was incompatible with what Egyptian television permits. This is a clean verdict. Egypt is not saying that one episode went too far. It is saying that Family Guy as an entity, as a thing that exists and produces content week after week, cannot exist within Egyptian broadcast space. Iran's ban is equally total and equally clean, but the reasoning is different.
Iran did not ban Family Guy because of how it treats religion, though the show's treatment of religion would likely be sufficient grounds on its own. Iran banned it because it has gay characters. The reasoning requires no further elaboration from the Iranian government's perspective. Iranian law criminalizes homosexuality. Iranian broadcast standards prohibit content that depicts gay people. Family Guy depicts gay people. The show cannot air. These two bans, Egypt's and Iran's, represent the most direct possible collision between the show's content and a country's values. There is no negotiation available. There is no version of the show that could be made that would satisfy both Egypt's religious broadcast standards and Family Guy's consistent treatment of religion as comedy material. There is no version of the show that could satisfy Iran's prohibition on gay characters and Family Guy's cast of recurring characters that includes gay people. The incompatibility is total. The ban is the only available response. Vietnam and Indonesia banned the show for offensiveness and indecency. These bans operate in a similar way to Egypt's. They are verdicts about the show's overall character, rather than responses to specific episodes. But the reasoning is broader and less specific. Offensiveness and indecency are categories with borders that shift depending on who is drawing them. What Vietnam and Indonesia have determined is that Family Guy falls outside those borders, reliably enough to justify removing it from the broadcast space entirely rather than managing it episode by episode. South Korea's ban is, as covered earlier in this essay, the one that carries the most structural irony. South Korea produces the animation. South Korean studios do the physical work of creating the show, and South Korea has banned the show from airing for its citizens. The person who drew the frames and the person who is not allowed to watch the frames could, theoretically, be the same person. The labor of production and the prohibition on consumption exist in the same country without the system that created that situation finding anything contradictory about it. India, Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, and South Africa represent variations on the same theme. The specific reasons given across these countries cluster around offensiveness and indecency, with the particular content generating those verdicts varying by country depending on which elements of the show's content most directly conflict with local broadcast standards. In some cases, the action taken is a complete prohibition. In others, it is a restriction or a ratings adjustment that limits the show's availability without removing it entirely. Venezuela's ban, which came in 2008 under Hugo Chavez, sits slightly apart from the others because its stated reasoning, the show being a bad influence on children, was applied to content that airs late at night with an adult rating in its country of origin. The Venezuelan government's concern was not primarily about what the show contained, but about what it represented in the context of a broader effort to limit American cultural influence in Venezuelan media. Family Guy was caught in that effort alongside The Simpsons, which is a tamer show by almost every measure. The ban was as much about where the show came from as about what it was. Now set all of those bans aside and look at the opposite end of the spectrum, the Arabic dub. Al-Majd TV, an Arabic-language broadcast network, chose not to ban Family Guy. It chose instead to rebuild it. The process of creating the Arabic dub required going through every episode and making decisions about every element. Music was removed throughout because music is considered off-limits in some interpretations of Islamic teaching, and the network's standards reflect that. Every scene in which Quagmire uses his left hand was identified, isolated, and flipped so that he appears to be using his right hand instead, because the left hand carries specific negative associations in Islamic tradition that the network did not want to put on screen. Content that conflicted with Islamic values, dialogue, visual gags, entire scenes, was cut or replaced with material that fit within the network's standards. Think about what that process requires. Someone had to watch every episode and mark the music. Someone had to watch every episode and mark the left-hand scenes. Someone had to watch every episode and identify the content that needed to be cut or replaced. The scale of that effort, applied to a show that was already past 10 seasons when Arabic dubbing began, is enormous. The network did not do this because Family Guy is easy content to work with. It did this because there was audience demand for the show. People wanted to watch it, and the network found a way to make that possible within its constraints. The Arabic dub is the most extreme example of the edit response, but it is not the only one. countries across the spectrum have made individual episode decisions rather than show-wide decisions. The episode Partial Terms of Endearment, which Fox refused to air in the United States because it centers on a storyline about whether a character will have an abortion, aired on BBC Three in the United Kingdom on June 20th, 2010. The episode that the American network that produces the show refused to broadcast was considered acceptable by a British broadcaster and aired to British audiences without incident. This is one of the most clarifying facts in the entire international history of Family Guy.
The show's home country, the country that created it and that has the broadest free speech protections in the world, refused to air an episode about abortion. A different Western country, operating under a different set of broadcast standards and cultural assumptions about what television can address, aired it without difficulty. The content did not change. The episode is the same episode. What changed is the country watching it and what that country has decided its audiences can handle. The episode Turban Cowboy was pulled from American streaming for 9 years after the Boston Marathon bombing. During those 9 years, it was available in Australia on Fox 8, in the United Kingdom on ITV2, and in Canada on Disney+. The episode that America could not stomach in the aftermath of a real terrorist attack was being watched by audiences in other English-speaking Western countries, without those countries feeling the need to restrict it. Same episode, different countries, different decisions about what the moment required. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the episode Fox initially refused to air because of concerns it could be read as anti-Semitic, eventually aired on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block in 2003, 4 years after it was produced, and then on Fox itself in 2004. The episode that was too sensitive to air in 2000 was considered acceptable 4 years later by the same network that originally refused it. The content did not change. What changed was the network's assessment of what the audience could receive. These decisions, taken together, reveal something that no single ban or single edit reveals on its own. There is no objective line that separates acceptable comedy from unacceptable comedy. The line exists, but it is not fixed. It moves depending on where you are, when you are watching, what has recently happened in the world, what your country's history is, what your government has decided its citizens need to be protected from, and what your broadcast standards were written to address. The same 30 minutes of television can be banned in one country, broadcast unedited in a second, broadcast in an edited version in a third, and available only on a DVD box set in a fourth. Family Guy exists in all of those forms simultaneously. There is the version that airs on Fox in America, complete and unedited, except for the occasional scene that pushes past what the network's standards division will approve. There is the BBC Three version that aired the abortion episode. There is the Arabic dub with no music and flipped hand scenes. There is the South Korean prohibition on watching a show whose frames were drawn in South Korea. There is the Russian regional deputy's official demand for a ban that has not been fully implemented. There is the Hulu version that was missing Turban Cowboy for 9 years and then quietly put it back. There is the Egyptian prohibition and the Iranian prohibition and the Vietnamese prohibition and all the others. All of these are responses to the same show. All of these represent a country or a broadcaster or a regulatory body deciding where their line is. The show did not move. The lines did. And what the lines reveal, when you draw them all on the same map, is the shape of the world's disagreement about a single question. The question is not whether Family Guy is offensive. Everyone agrees it is offensive. The question is what offense is for, and what it is allowed to do, and who gets to decide, and whether the decision belongs to a government, or a broadcaster, or a network, or an individual viewer sitting alone with a remote control. Egypt says the government decides. Iran says the government decides. South Korea says the government decides, while its studios draw the frames. The United States says the market decides, mostly, with some regulatory input from the FCC and some pressure from groups like the Parents Television Council, none of which has managed to remove the show from air in over 25 years of trying. The BBC said its editorial standards decide, and its editorial standards said the abortion episode was fine. Al Majd TV said its own standards decide,
and its standards produced a version of the show that Seth MacFarlane would not recognize as his. The show that started in 1999 as a dysfunctional family comedy in a fictional Rhode Island town became, over the following quarter century, an accidental document of where every country in the world keeps its line. Every ban is a line. Every edit is a line. Every pulled episode is a line. Every altered dub is a line drawn around what a country believes comedy is permitted to touch and what it must be kept away from, and what the cost of crossing that boundary is. Family Guy crossed every one of those lines. It did it without looking down, without slowing down, and without changing direction. The lines multiplied, the bans accumulated, the edits kept coming, the show kept going. It is still going. And somewhere right now, in a country that has decided the show cannot air, someone is watching it anyway. On a phone, through a connection that routes around the prohibition, in a language that is not the language of the dub their country approved. They are watching Peter Griffin do something stupid, and Brian Griffin say something smart, and Stewie Griffin plan something terrible, and they are laughing, and the line their country drew is somewhere behind them, and they crossed it without thinking about it, the way Family Guy crosses every line it encounters, without looking down. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.